Tonight, we explore a different fate for the king in the north, a world where Jon Snow broke the only oath that ever meant anything to him. When the news came north that Eddard Stark had been executed on the steps of the Great Sept, Jon did not stay at the wall. He took his white wolf and rode south in the dark, a deserter, a man with no honor left to stand on, to find the brother he had left behind. He did not know what was waiting at a castle called the Twins. He did not have prophecy or proof. He had only a soldier's unease, a careful lord who smiled too little, a slighted house that nursed its grievance, scouts who rode out and did not ride back, and a direwolf that growled at men who had done nothing yet. Jon Snow would stop the Red Wedding. But you cannot cheat the gods of a death that has been paid for, and the saving would cost him the one person who had never loved him, and a home he could never return to clean. This is the story of what might have happened if Jon Snow stopped the Red Wedding. The Wall. The night he left. 299 AC. Jon Snow left the Wall on a moonless night, and he left it like a thief. That was the part that stayed with him afterward. Not the cold, not the fear of the rangers who might catch him, but the shape of the leaving. He had imagined in the hours before that desertion would feel like a decision, a thing a man chose, weighed and committed to with his chin up. It did not feel like that. It felt like theft. He saddled a horse that belonged to the watch with hands that belonged to the watch, and he rode through a gate that the watch had trusted him to guard, and every part of it was stolen, and he knew it, and he did it anyway. Ghost ran beside the horse. The white wolf made no sound. He never did. He ran through the dark with the silence that had named him, and his red eyes caught what little light there was, and he did not question where they were going because Ghost did not question Jon. The wolf had decided, long ago and without ceremony, that Jon was the thing he followed. The watch's gate meant nothing to him. Oaths meant nothing to him. There was Jon, and there was everything that was not Jon, and the wolf knew the difference and acted on it. Jon envied him that. He had heard about his father 3 days before. The raven had come to Castle Black, and the news had moved through the castle as bad news moves, quietly, and then all at once. And by the time it reached Jon, it had already become the thing it was going to be. Lord Eddard Stark, Hand of the King, executed for treason on the steps of the Great Sept of Baelor. Beheaded. With his own sword, men said, though Jon did not know if that part was true, and did not want to know. He had not wept. He had wanted to, and had not been able to, which was worse. He had stood on the wall in the wind, and looked south toward a city he had never seen, and a father he would never see again. And he had felt the thing in him that had always been there, the thing that was not quite a Stark and not quite anything else, the thing that belonged nowhere. And he had understood, with a clarity that frightened him, that he was going to leave. Robb was marching. Robb had called the banners and ridden south with the strength of the north to free their father, and their father was dead now, and Robb was alone down there with a war and a crown that men were already whispering about, and Jon was 800 miles away in a black cloak guarding a wall against an enemy that the South did not believe in. His place was with his brother. That was the thought that had ridden him for 3 days. It was a clean thought. It was the kind of thought a man could act on. And underneath it, where he did not like to look, was the other thing. The desertion was not only loyalty, it was escape. The Wall was a sentence he had volunteered for before he understood it, an oath he had sworn in the snow with Ghost beside him, and a heart full of a boy's idea of glory, and the oath had curdled into the thing oaths became when you understood that they were forever. He was not riding only toward Robb. He was riding away from forever. He knew it. and the knowing was the worst part. Because Jon Snow had spent his whole life believing that honor was the one thing a bastard could own outright. The Starks had given him their faces and their training and their name's shadow, but not the name. The one thing that was his, the one thing no true-born lord could claim more of than he could, was that he kept his word. He was not going to be able to say that anymore. Samwell Tarly had found him saddling the horse. Sam had said nothing for a long moment. He had stood in the dark with his soft face and his frightened eyes, and he had looked at the saddle and the wolf and Jon's face, and he had understood all of it at once, as Sam understood things, slowly in some ways and very fast in others. "They'll call you a deserter," Sam had said. "I am one," Jon had said. "They behead deserters." "I know what they do, Sam." Sam had stood there. He was not a brave man in his body. He said so himself, freely, without the shame other men attached to it. But he had a different kind of courage, the kind that said hard things to people it loved. "Your father wouldn't have done this," Sam had said. And Jon had stopped, with his hand on the saddle, because it was true, and because it was the cruelest thing Sam could have said, and because Sam had said it anyway, out of love, to try to stop him. "My father is dead," Jon had said, "and he died keeping his honor. And it didn't save him. It didn't save anyone." He had pulled the strap tight. "I'm done watching honor get good men killed from 800 miles away." Sam had not had an answer for that. Jon had ridden out. He did not look back at the wall. He had heard that men looked back, that the wall pulled at deserters as home pulls at any man leaving it. He did not look back because he was afraid that if he saw it, he would understand what he was throwing away and turn around. And he could not turn around because Robb was in the south alone. Ghost ran beside him in the dark. The wall fell away behind them, 700 feet of ice, and 8,000 years of men who had not done what Jon was doing, and Jon Snow rode south into a country at war as the one thing he had sworn he would never be, a man without honor. The road, what it cost to get there. The road south was longer than grief and shorter than he wanted. He kept off the King's Road. A deserter in a black cloak on the main road was a dead man or a captured one, and he was no use to Robb as either. So he rode the backways and the field tracks and the drovers' paths, and he slept in the cold without fire more nights than not. And Ghost hunted for them both because a man travelling secret could not always feed himself. He shed the black somewhere south of the gift. He kept the cloak. It was warm, and warmth was not a thing a man threw away in the north for the sake of symbol, but he turned it inside out so the black did not show. And he took the clasp of the watch off it and put the clasp in his pocket, and then, a day later, threw the clasp in a river. He watched it sink. He did not know why he had carried it the extra day. Some part of him had not been ready to be rid of the last metal that said what he had been. He thought about his father on the road, not the execution. He could not think about the execution. The mind slid off it like a hand off ice. He thought about Winterfell, about Ned Stark in the Godswood with the great sword across his knees, cleaning it, as he did when something weighed on him, about the few times his father had looked at him with something that was not quite permission to ask the question Jon had wanted to ask his whole life. Who was my mother? And had never asked, because the not asking was easier than the disappointment of the deflection. He would never ask now. That was a grief of its own, separate from the rest. His father had died with the answer in him, and the answer had gone into the ground at the Great Sept, or wherever they had put him, and Jon Snow would never know whose blood he carried on the side that wasn't Stark. He had made his peace with not knowing years ago, the peace you make with a missing finger. Now the not knowing was permanent in a way it had not been before, and the permanence reopened it. He pushed it down. He had a brother to reach. He found the war before he found Robb. He found it as you find a war when you are traveling alone. The burned holdfast. The field that should have had crops and had bodies instead. The woman who would not look at him because men on horses had stopped being a thing that meant safety. The Riverlands had been the war's anvil for 2 years. The Lannisters had burned it, and the Northern Army had bled across it, and the small folk had been ground between the two until the land itself looked exhausted. Jon rode through it and felt the helplessness of one man with one sword in a country that had been broken by armies. Near the Trident he was nearly taken. A Lannister outrider patrol, 6 men, mounted, sweeping the country for exactly the kind of lone rider Jon was. They saw him across a field and turned toward him, and Jon ran, because 6 was too many, and the chase went into a tree line, and Ghost came out of the trees into the middle of it. The wolf was full grown now. He was the size of a small horse, and he moved like something the world had forgotten to be afraid of, and then suddenly remembered. And the Lannister horses lost their minds at the smell of him, and 2 riders went down in the chaos. And the other 4 decided that whatever the lone rider was worth, it was not worth the white thing with the red eyes. Jon killed one of the unhorsed men because the man was reaching for a crossbow. He did it without thinking and thought about it afterward for a long time. The man had a Lannister face, not noble, just a soldier. Somebody's son from the Westerlands who had been sent east to fight in a war he probably did not understand any better than the small folk whose fields he was burning. Jon killed him and took his horse as a remount and rode on, and the killing sat in him alongside the desertion, another stone in a bag that was getting heavy. This was what he had come south for. Not the killing, the being there. The standing beside Robb. He told himself that the killing was part of the price, and that the price was worth paying, and he mostly believed it. Mostly, there was a night near the twins on the way down, though he did not know then what the twins would come to mean, when Jon nearly turned back. He had stopped at a crossroads inn, the kind of place a careful traveller avoided, but the cold had been brutal, and Ghost had been ranging wide after game, and Jon had wanted, for one night, walls and a fire. There were men in the common room, and they were talking, as men in inns talked, about the war and the king in the north and the great doings of the age. And one of them was talking about deserters. Caught one up near Long Lake, the man said. Crow that ran from the wall. They hanged him from a tree on the King's Road with his black cloak still on him. For everyone to see. That's the law. A man swears the black. He wears it till he dies. And if he runs, he dies sooner. The man spat into the fire. No worse creature than an oathbreaker. A man who'll break one vow will break any. Can't trust him at your back. Can't trust him at your table. Better off dead. The lot of them. Jon had sat in the corner with his hood up and his common sword and his inside-out cloak, and said nothing. He had listened to a stranger describe him as a creature better off dead, and he had not been able to argue with it, because by the lights of the world the man was right. Jon had sworn the black. Jon had run. By every law of the Watch and the realm, Jon was the creature the man described, the thing you hanged from a tree as a warning to others. He had gone up to his cold little room and sat on the edge of the straw bed and thought, for a long while, about turning back. Not because he believed the Watch would forgive him, there was no forgiveness, only the noose. But because the man's words had found the exact place where Jon's own doubt lived and pressed on it, and Jon had thought, maybe he's right. Maybe a man who breaks the one oath is rotten clean through. Maybe I'm not riding to save my brother. Maybe I'm just an oathbreaker telling himself a story about loyalty so he doesn't have to call himself what he is. Ghost had come back near dawn. The wolf had appeared at the window. They were never far apart, even when they ranged, and had looked at Jon with the red eyes that asked nothing and judged nothing. And Jon had looked back at the one creature in the world that did not care that he was an oathbreaker, and had made his decision again. The wolf did not care about oaths. The wolf cared about the pack. And Robb was the pack, alone in the south. And whatever Jon was, oathbreaker, deserter, creature better off dead, he was going to reap his brother. And the world could hang him for it afterward, if the world could catch him. He rode out before the inn woke. He left coin on the table for the room, more than it was worth, as if paying honestly for a bed could balance against a broken vow. It could not, but he left it anyway, because a man holds on to the small honesties when the large ones are gone, as a drowning man holds to anything that floats. He reached the northern army outside River Run in the 3rd week. The wall behind him, what he left undone. Jon did not know what happened at the wall after he left. He could only imagine it. And he did imagine it. On the cold nights on the road. Because a man's mind goes to the things he has done when there is nothing else to occupy it. He imagined the morning they found him gone. The empty bunk. The missing horse. The slow understanding moving through Castle Black. Lord Snow has deserted. And the shame of it, because Jon had been someone at the wall. He had been the Lord Commander's man, marked for better things, the kind of recruit the Watch built its future on. Old Bear Mormont had given him a Valyrian steel sword. Longclaw, the Mormont ancestral blade, had given it to a bastard boy, because the boy had pulled him from a fire, and because Mormont saw something in him worth the gift. Jon had left Longclaw at the wall. That was the one thing he had not been able to steal. He had stolen a horse and watch provisions and his own freedom, but he could not steal the sword. Longclaw had been a gift, the most precious thing anyone had ever given him, given in trust, given to a man of the Watch for the Watch's work. To take it south on a desertion would have been a theft of a different order, not stealing from an institution, but stealing from the old man who had loved him enough to give a bastard a lord's blade. Jon had left it on Mormont's table with no note, because there was no note that could have said the thing, and he had ridden out with a common steel sword instead, and the absence of Longclaw at his hip was its own small, constant grief on the road. He imagined Mormont finding the sword, the old man's face, the disappointment of a man who had wagered on someone and lost. He imagined Sam defending him to men who wanted him named a deserter and marked for death. And Sam would defend him, Jon knew, would stammer and sweat and say the true things in Jon's favor to men who did not want to hear them, because that was Sam's courage, the courage that lived in the soft, frightened body. Jon hoped it did not cost Sam too much. He had not thought, when he left, about what his desertion would cost the friend who stayed. That was the thing about breaking faith Jon was learning. It was never clean. It never cost only the man who broke it. It rippled out, to Sam, to Mormont, to the Watch that was one sword shorter on a wall that could not spare swords, to every recruit who would hear the story of Lord Snow who ran and learned from it that oaths were things a man could set down when they grew heavy. Jon had told himself, on the night he left, that the desertion was his own to carry. It was not. No broken oath ever was. He carried it anyway, because the alternative was Robb alone in the south, and that he could not carry at all. Robb. The brothers meet again. The sentries took him for an enemy until Ghost walked out of the dark. There were men in the northern camp who had been at Winterfell, who knew the direwolves on sight, and the word went up the line fast. A direwolf. A white one, Lord Snow's wolf. And by the time Jon was brought to the centre of the camp, half the men who had grown up hearing about the Stark wolves had come out to look. Robb came out of his tent without a cloak. He had grown. That was the first thing Jon saw. Robb had ridden south, a boy of 15, and the war had made him something else. The shoulders heavier, the face harder, a beard coming in red where Jon's came in dark. He wore a crown. It was a simple thing, bronze and iron, open at the top, the old crown of the Kings of Winter remade, and it sat on Robb's head, like a thing he had not yet decided whether he had earned. The brothers looked at each other across the firelight. "You're supposed to be at the wall," Robb said. "I know," Jon said. "You took a vow." "I know that too." Robb's face did something complicated. He was the king in the north now, and there were men watching, and a king could not be seen to approve of desertion. Desertion was the thing that unmade armies. the rot that turned a host into a mob, and Jon saw Robb understand all of that in the space of a breath, saw him weigh the crown against the brother, and saw which one won. Robb crossed the space and embraced him. "Father's dead," Robb said into his shoulder. "I know," Jon said. "That's why I came." They held on to each other as they hadn't done since they were boys, the king in the north and the deserter, and Ghost stood at the edge of the firelight and watched the camp watch them, and for one moment Jon thought, this was worth it. Whatever it costs. Standing here with my brother, when he has no one else who knew him before all this was worth it. He would remember thinking that. Later, in the tent, with wine and the flap closed, and only grey wind and Ghost for witnesses, Robb stopped being the king and was just his brother, tired in a way that went past the body. "They made me a king," Robb said. He said it like a confession. "The lords, after father. The Great Jon put his sword at my feet and the rest followed, and I didn't ask for it, Jon. I wanted to save father. That's all. I marched to save father, and now father's dead and I'm a king, and I don't know how to stop being one." "You don't stop," Jon said. "Not now. Not in the middle." "I know." Robb drank. "I've made mistakes. I won't. I'll tell you about them. Not tonight. There's a thing with the Freys I have to fix, and a thing with my mother, and a thing with—" He stopped, rubbed his face. "Tonight I just want my brother. Is that allowed? For one night?" "It's allowed," Jon said. They drank. Outside, the camp settled into its night. 18,000 Northmen and Rivermen sleeping in a country that wanted them gone, and the two direwolves lay near the brazier, and the brothers talked about Winterfell, and Bran, and Rickon, and Arya, who was missing, and Sansa, who was a hostage in King's Landing, and they did not talk about the things that were coming, because they did not know what was coming. Jon did not know yet. He would start to notice in the morning. The Lords. What a deserter is worth. Not everyone in the camp was glad to see him. Robb's joy at his brother's arrival was real, and the common soldiers, who had grown up on stories of the Stark wolves, were glad enough of a direwolf in the camp and a Stark face among them. But the Lords were a different matter, and Jon learned that fast, because the Lords had not survived 2 years of war by being sentimental about oaths. The Great Jon said it plainest, the second day, in the king's tent, when Robb was not present to soften it. "You ran from the wall," the Great Jon said. He was a huge man, loud and blunt, and he did not bother to lower his voice. "You swore the black and you ran. I've no quarrel with you as the king's brother, boy, and I'll not pretend the wolf didn't make my own men glad. But a man who breaks one oath has shown the shape of him. How do we know you'll not break another when the breaking suits you?" It was a fair question. Jon hated it for being fair. "You don't," Jon said. "You'll have to watch me and decide, the same as you'd watch any man." The Great Jon studied him. He had expected an argument, Jon thought, a deserter's excuses, the reasons men gave for the things they'd done. He had not expected the plain agreement, and it gave him pause. "Huh," the Great Jon said. "Honest about it, at least. Most oathbreakers have 100 reasons why their oath didn't count." He grunted. "Your father was the most honourable man I ever bent a knee to. It sits ill, seeing his blood run from a vow. Even his bastard's blood." "It sits ill with me too," Jon said. "I didn't do it because the oath stopped mattering. I did it because my brother was alone and I couldn't stay behind a wall while he died in the south. That doesn't make it right. It just makes it mine." He held the big man's gaze. "I'll not ask you to trust me. I'll earn it or I won't. That's all a deserter can offer." The Great Jon looked at him a long moment. "We'll see," he said, which wasn't trust, but was not contempt either. And from the great Jon Umber, it was as much as a deserter could hope for. It was worse with some of the others. Lord Karstark, Rickard Karstark, a grim man made grimmer by the deaths of his sons in the war, would not speak to Jon at all, and made his disdain plain in how he turned from him in the council and the yard. Jon did not blame him. The man had lost sons to oaths, kept and broken both, and a deserter walking free in the king's own tent was an offence to everything Karstark believed about how the world should hold together. The distrust followed Jon through the camp. He felt it as he had felt the cold unease about the Freys, a thing under the surface, present in every hall he entered. He was the king's brother and a hero's son, and a deserter all at once, and the three did not sit easily together, and the men who served Robb did not quite know what to do with him. It taught Jon something he would need later. It taught him what it was to be right and distrusted at the same time, to carry a true thing in a camp full of men who had every reason to discount the man carrying it. When he began to fear the trap at the twins, when he began trying to make men believe him, he was already a man they had decided to doubt. The desertion had cost him more than his honor. It had cost him the thing a man needs most when he is trying to warn people of a danger they cannot see. It had cost him the benefit of the doubt. A man they trusted, warning of a trap, might have been heeded. A deserter warning of a trap was just a deserter, seeing shadows. Jon would feel the full weight of that before the end. The wolves. What they knew. Grey Wind knew his brother's wolf at once. The two direwolves met at the centre of the camp on the first morning, and Jon held his breath, because direwolves were not dogs, and there was no telling how two grown males would take each other. But they did not fight. They circled once, the grey and the white, the great heads low, and then something passed between them that was older than the camp and older than the war. The recognition of littermates, of the pack that had been whelped together in the snow outside Winterfell and scattered to the winds of Westeros. Grey Wind pressed his head against Ghost's shoulder. Ghost stood still and let him. And then they were a pack again, 2 of the 6, moving through the camp side by side. And the men who saw it went quiet, because there was something in it that touched the old North. The North of the first men. The North that remembered when the Starks and the wolves were closer kin than men like to think about now. Jon watched the wolves and thought about the others. Lady, dead in the south, killed on a queen's word when Jon's sisters first went to King's Landing. Nymeria, run wild in the Riverlands somewhere, lost with Arya. Summer with Bran and Shaggy Dog with Rickon, wherever they were, if they lived. 6 wolves for 6 children. And the wolves had scattered exactly as the children had scattered. And the 2 here in the camp, Grey Wind and Ghost, were together because Robb and Jon were together. And there was a rightness to that, and a grief in it both. The wolves became Jon's confirmation in the days that followed. He could not always trust his own fear. The doubt ate at him, the question of whether he was seeing real danger or a deserter's ghosts. But the wolves did not doubt. The wolves did not have guilt to project or shame to throw shadows with. They simply knew, in the wordless way of beasts, who in the camp was safe and who was not. And both wolves disliked the same men. Grey Wind, Jon learned, had taken against the Freys from the first, had snarled at the Frey envoys who came to the camp, had to be chained when they were near, as a dog will not be talked out of its judgment of a man. Robb had laughed it off. A wolf that disliked the Freys was no great mystery, given how everyone disliked the Freys. But Jon remembered it, and when he saw Ghost stop and raise his hackles at Roose Bolton, and later learned that Grey Wind had done the same, that Robb's own wolf, the King's wolf, would not suffer Roose Bolton near him and had to be kept apart from the Lord of the Dreadfort, Jon felt the cold in his stomach turn to something harder. 2 direwolves, whelped together, separated for 2 years, reunited in a war camp. And they disliked, independently, without conferring, without any way to have shared a suspicion, the exact same men, the Freys and Roose Bolton. The men who would, in a few weeks, murder them all at a wedding. Jon tried to tell Robb this too, that both wolves had marked the same men, that it was not one beast whim, but 2 beasts in agreement. And Robb, who loved Grey Wind and trusted him on the battlefield with his life, who let the wolf sleep at the foot of his bed, could not quite make himself believe that the wolf's dislike was evidence of anything but the wolf's good taste. "Grey Wind doesn't like half my bannermen," Robb said. "He doesn't like the smell of the Stark men because they smell of the dogs they keep. He doesn't like Bolton because Bolton smells of... I don't know what Bolton smells of. Leeches. Cold. The wolf's a wolf, Jon. He's not a judge." "He's a better judge than your council," Jon said. "He judged the Freys right. Everyone agrees he judged the Freys right. Why is he wrong about Bolton?" Robb had no answer to that. But he did not act on it either, because a king cannot move against his most senior commander on the strength of 2 wolves' hackles, and Jon knew it, and the knowing was the whole shape of his helplessness. He had 2 direwolves telling him the truth, and the truth that 2 direwolves tell is still not a fact a man can take to a war council. The camp. What Jon started to see. Jon had been a soldier long enough to read a camp. The watch had taught him that, if nothing else, how a body of armed men felt when it was healthy, and how it felt when something was wrong. You could walk a camp and feel its morale through your boots. The wall's garrison had its own version of this, and the Northern Army had another, and Jon spent his first full day in Robb's host, walking it and reading it, because he did not know what else to do with himself, and because reading the camp was a thing he knew how to do. The camp was not healthy. It was not mutinous. The Northmen loved Robb. That was plain. The fierce love of hard men for a young lord who had won them battles. But underneath the love there was something else. A thinness. The host had been in the field for 2 years, and it was a long way from home. And the harvest was coming in the north without the men who should have been bringing it in. And the war that had started as vengeance for Ned Stark had become a thing without a clear end. You could feel the men asking the question that armies asked when they had been out too long. What are we doing here? And when do we go home? That was ordinary. Armies always asked it. Jon noted it and moved on. The thing he could not move on from was the Freys. There were Frey men in the camp, a contingent, sour-faced, kept somewhat apart from the Northmen by a coldness that ran in both directions. Jon asked about them and got the story in pieces. Robb had needed to cross the twins at the start of the war, and old Walder Frey held the crossing, and the price of the crossing had been a betrothal. Robb would marry a Frey girl when the war was won. And then Robb had married someone else, a Westerling girl, from the crag, in the Westerlands. A love match, or something near it, made in a moment of fever and grief and need, and it had broken the Frey pact, and old Walder Frey was not a man who forgave a broken pact. Jon stood in the camp and felt something cold settle in his stomach. He did not have a name for it yet. It was not knowledge. It was the soldier's thing, the prickle at the back of the neck, the sense that a piece of the board was wrong. He looked at the Frey men keeping their sour distance, and he thought about old men who nursed grievances, and about how much of this war had turned on the crossing of a single river. And he thought, Walder Frey holds the only bridge over the Green Fork for 100 miles, and Robb broke faith with him, and Walder Frey is not in this camp to make peace. He told himself he was being a deserter. That was the other thing the cold could be. Not a soldier's instinct, but a deserter's guilt. The mind of a man who had broken his own faith, now seeing broken faith everywhere, projecting his own dishonor onto the world. He had broken an oath. Was he seeing oath-breaking because it was there, or because he was carrying it? He did not know. He could not tell from the inside whether he was seeing a real thing or a shadow his own shame had thrown. That uncertainty would ride him all the way to the twins. He went to find Robb's war council, to listen, and to learn what he could. The council. The plan to mend the breach. The plan was already made by the time Jon arrived. He listened to it in the command tent, standing at the back where a deserter belonged, while Robb and his lords laid it out. The strategy had a hard logic to it, and Jon could not fault the logic, which was part of what made the cold in his stomach worse. The plan was sound, and sound plans were the easiest ones to die inside. Robb needed the North back. He had lost the Westerlands campaign's momentum. Winterfell had fallen, taken by Theon Greyjoy, who had turned his cloak and then burned by men whose identity was still unclear. And Bran and Rickon were missing and presumed dead, though Robb did not believe they were dead, and Jon did not either, because believing it was not survivable. The North was occupied. The Ironborn held the coast, and someone held Winterfell's ashes, and Robb's whole cause was bleeding out from the home he had left undefended. To take the North back, he needed to march home. To march home, he needed to cross the Green Fork. To cross the Green Fork, he needed the twins. And the twins belonged to Walder Frey, whom he had wronged. "He'll have us back," Catelyn Stark said. "For a price. Walder Frey is grasping and proud, and he was insulted. But he is not a fool, and there is more profit for him in mending this than in nursing it. We offer a marriage to mend the broken one. Edmure will marry a Frey girl in Robb's place. The old man gets a Tully Lord for a daughter, which is more than he was ever promised. It will serve." Jon looked at Catelyn. He had not seen her since Winterfell. She had aged. The war had aged all of them. But grief had done its own work on her. The loss of her husband and the not knowing about her younger sons. She had never been warm to Jon. She was not warm to him now. She had looked at him when he entered the camp with the complicated look of a woman seeing her husband's bastard appear, like a ghost from a past she had tried to close. And she had said nothing to him. And Jon had expected nothing, because there had never been anything between them, but a coldness that was older than Jon's understanding of it. But she was clever. He had always known she was clever, and the plan she was laying out was a clever plan, and that was exactly why it frightened him, because Walder Frey would know it was clever too. "And if he doesn't mean it," Jon said. The tent went quiet. A deserter had spoken in the king's council. Lords turned to look at him with the specific affront of men who did not think he had earned the right. The Great Jon's brows came down. Robb's face stayed neutral, but Jon saw him tense, the king calculating how to manage his brother's intrusion. "Explain yourself," Catelyn said. Cold, precise. Jon chose his words as a man chooses his steps on ice. "Walder Frey held the crossing at the start of the war and made the king pay for it," Jon said. "He's a man who understood in that moment exactly how much power he had, that the whole war turned on his bridge. Then the king broke the pact. A man like that, a proud man, a grasping man, who was shown his own importance and then insulted." Jon looked at Robb. "I'd want to be very sure his welcome was real before I walked my army across his bridge." "You think it's a trap," the Great Jon said. "Not hostile, thinking." "I think I don't know," Jon said. "I think no one in this tent knows. And I think the crossing of that river is the single most dangerous moment of this whole march, and I think we should treat it that way." Catelyn's face had not softened, but something behind it had shifted. "It is guessed right," she said. "Whatever Walder Frey is, he is a lord of the Trident and bound by the laws of hospitality as surely as any man in Westeros. Once we have eaten his bread and salt under his roof, he can no more raise a hand to us than he could raise it to the gods themselves. Guessed right is older than the Freys. It is older than the Andals. No lord breaks it." She held Jon's gaze. "Not even a Frey." Jon held her gaze back. "I hope you're right," he said. He meant it. He hoped she was right with everything in him. The cold in his stomach did not believe she was. The queen he chose. Robb's wound. Jon met the Westerling girl on the third day and understood his brother's mistake and forgave it and feared it. Her name was Jane. She was gentle and lovely and frightened, a girl of the Westerlands caught up in a war that was not hers, married to a king in a moment that had clearly been larger than either of them. Jon watched Robb with her and saw the thing that had made the marriage, saw that Robb loved her, really loved her, that it had not been mere lust or mere honor, but the genuine thing, a young man's whole heart given away in the middle of a war to a girl who had been kind to him when he was wounded and grieving and far from home. He could not hate it. Jon of all men understood doing the dishonorable thing because the honorable thing felt impossible in the moment. Robb had taken the girl's maidenhead, or believed he had, and Robb was Ned Stark's son, and a Stark did not leave a girl shamed. He had married her to do right by her. It was the most Stark thing imaginable, to break a strategic betrothal, not out of passion alone, but out of a stubborn northern honor that would not let him use a girl and discard her. And it was going to get them all killed. That was the cruelty of it. The kind of cruelty Jon was coming to understand was the shape of the whole world. Robb had done a decent thing, a kind thing, an honorable thing by his own lights, and it had broken the pact with Walder Frey. And the breaking of that pact was the crack through which all the coming horror would pour. Honor had killed Ned Stark in King's Landing. Now a different honor, Robb's honor, the honor of a boy who would not shame a girl he'd bedded, was loading the crossbows in the gallery of the twins, though no one knew it yet. "You think I was a fool?" Robb said to him that evening. He had seen Jon watching. "I think you were kind," Jon said, "and I think kindness and foolishness look the same from the outside, and only the gods can tell them apart. And the gods don't tell." Robb almost smiled. "Mother says I was a fool. She doesn't say it, but she says it. Your mother has lost a great deal to this war," Jon said. "She's allowed to wish you'd married a bridge instead of a girl." "I couldn't," Robb said. Quiet. "Jon, I couldn't. I'd taken her. She'd given me. I couldn't just leave her ruined and ride off to marry some Frey girl I'd never met. Father wouldn't have. Father would have done what I did." "Father would have," Jon agreed. And that was the heart of it, the thing that made the whole tragedy turn. Robb had done what Ned would have done, and Ned's honor had gotten Ned killed, and Robb's was going to get Robb killed. And the lesson neither of them could quite learn in time was that the world they lived in did not reward the thing the Starks were best at. It punished it. It had always punished it. The Starks kept being surprised by this, generation after generation, because they could not quite believe that a thing as good as honor could be a thing that killed you. "I'm going to mend it," Robb said. "The Frey thing. Edmure's marriage will mend it. The old man gets his Tully match. His pride is salved. The crossing's open. And we go home." He looked at Jon. "You don't think it'll work?" "I think it might," Jon said carefully. "I think it might work exactly as your mother planned. And I think we should walk into it as if it might not, because the cost of being wrong is everything, and the cost of being careful is only a little discomfort." Robb nodded slowly. He did not fully believe Jon. Jon could see that. Robb wanted the mending to work because he needed it to work, because the alternative was unbearable, and a man who needs a thing to be true has already half decided to believe it is. That was the other crack, not just the broken pact, but Robb's need to believe the pact could be cheaply mended, his hope that one decent act could undo another, that the board could be set right with a single clever marriage. Hope is a kind of blindness, Jon was learning. The men who walked into the twins walked in hopeful that the welcome was real, that the old laws held, that a wedding was a wedding and not a slaughterhouse. Their hope was reasonable. It was also the thing that killed them, because hope made them slow, and slow was death in that hall. Jon did not have hope. Jon had a deserter's certainty that the world was worse than men wanted it to be. It was a miserable thing to carry. It was also, in the end, the thing that saved his brother's life. Roose Bolton, the man who smiled too little. The second thing Jon noticed was Roose Bolton. He noticed him, because Ghost noticed him first. It happened on the second day in the camp, when Jon was walking the lines with the wolf at his heel. Roose Bolton was crossing toward the command tent, a lean man, neither old nor young, with pale eyes the colour of dirty ice, and a stillness about him that the other lords did not have. The northern lords were loud men, most of them, hard and boisterous, and quick to anger, and quick to laugh. Roose Bolton was quiet in a way that made the loudness around him seem like a performance he was watching. Ghost stopped. The wolf did not growl. Ghost almost never growled. He was a silent animal in his threats as in everything else, but he stopped, and his hackles came up along his spine, and he stood between Jon and Roose Bolton with the stillness of a predator that had identified another predator. Roose Bolton looked at the wolf. He did not flinch. Most men flinched at Ghost. The wolf was a frightening thing up close. The size and the silence and the red eyes. Roose Bolton looked at the direwolf as he looked at everything, with the pale, flat assessment of a man pricing a horse. And then he looked at Jon, and he inclined his head a precise degree, and he walked on. Jon watched him go. "Easy," he said to Ghost. The wolf's hackles stayed up until Bolton was inside the command tent. Jon asked about Roose Bolton the way he had asked about the Freys, in pieces, from men who would talk to a deserter, which was a smaller set than the men who would talk to a lord, but not an empty one. The story he assembled was not damning. Roose Bolton was the lord of the Dreadfort, the head of a house that had been the Starks' great rivals in the ancient north before they bent the knee 1,000 years ago. He was one of Robb's chief commanders. He had held the northern infantry at the Green Fork against Tywin Lannister himself. A holding action, a sacrifice play. He had spent men there, a great many men, and the spending had let Robb win his victory in the west. That was the part that caught in Jon's mind. He had spent a great many men. Jon had been a soldier long enough to know that holding actions cost lives, and that sometimes the cost was necessary. But he had also been a soldier long enough to know the difference between a commander who spent lives because he had to, and a commander who spent them because the spending served him. And the stories about the Green Fork had a specific shape that Jon did not like. The men Roose Bolton had spent there had been, disproportionately, men whose loyalty to the Boltons was thin. Rivals' levies. The kind of men a careful lord might be glad to be rid of. It might mean nothing. Battles were chaos, and chaos killed unevenly, and a man could read a pattern into any slaughter if he wanted one. But Ghost had stopped. Jon trusted Ghost. He had learned to. The wolf did not reason as men reason, did not assemble cases and weigh evidence, but the wolf knew things, read things in men below the level where men lied, smelled the difference between a man who wished you well and a man who did not. Ghost had walked past the Great Jon and Dacey Mormont and Robb's other lords without a flicker. Ghost had stopped for Roose Bolton. That was not proof. Jon was learning that nothing was going to be proof. That was the shape of the thing he was caught in. 100 small signs, no single one of them damning, and a brother's life resting on whether the signs added to something or to nothing. He started watching Roose Bolton. He did it carefully because Bolton was the kind of man who would notice being watched, and a deserter watching a great lord was a thing that could get the deserter killed with no questions asked. He watched how Bolton moved through the camp. He watched who Bolton spoke to and who he did not. He watched the leeches. Bolton's Meister bled him with leeches, an eccentricity, a coldness even in his own blood. And he watched the pale eyes that gave away nothing. And he watched the messages. The messages. What went out of the camp? Every army sent messages. That was not suspicious. Ravens went out daily, to bannermen, to garrisons, to the lords who held the North's scattered strength, to River Run and the River Lords and the holdfasts that still answered Robb's call. A king at war lived and died by his messages, and the maester's tent was one of the busiest in the camp, the birds going up at all hours. Jon could not read the messages. He had no access to the maester's tent and no way to intercept a raven that he did not see coming. What he could do was watch the patterns, who sent birds, how often, and roughly where the birds went, because a raven flew in a line you could mark if you watched it leave. Roose Bolton sent birds south and east. South and east of the camp at River Run was the Twins. And beyond the Twins, further east and south, was the Lannister host, Tywin, at Harrenhal, or wherever Tywin had moved to, the spider at the center of the southern web. A bird flying toward the Twins meant nothing. The Twins were where the army was going. Of course there were messages to the Twins. A bird flying toward the Lannister lines could mean a dozen innocent things, or it could mean the one thing Jon's stomach kept insisting on, and Jon could not tell which, because all he had was the direction of birds, and the direction of birds was not proof of anything. He needed to know what was in them. He could not find out. That was the torment of those weeks. Jon could see the shape of a thing without being able to grasp it, like a man watching a current move under ice. He knew something was flowing. He could not break through to it. And the more he watched, the less he could tell whether he was tracking a real conspiracy or constructing one, the way a man alone in the dark constructs shapes out of shadows, because the mind cannot bear a featureless dark. He went to Robb. He chose the moment carefully. Late, after the council, when Robb was alone with the wine and the maps and the exhaustion of a king who could never stop being one. He told him about the Freys, the grievance, the danger of the crossing. He told him about Roose Bolton, carefully, watching Robb's face. Robb listened. He was a good listener. Ned had raised him to be. But Jon watched the listening and saw the problem with it, which was that Robb could not afford to believe him. Roose Bolton held the Green Fork against Tywin Lannister, Robb said. He's lost more men in my cause than any lord but the Great Jon. He's the warden of he's my most senior commander, Jon. If I start suspecting Roose Bolton on the strength of your wolf's hackles, I have to suspect everyone. And an army where the king suspects his own commanders is an army that's already lost. I'm not asking you to suspect him, Jon said. I'm asking you to be careful. I'm always careful. You married the Westerling girl, Jon said. It came out harder than he meant it. Robb's face closed. I'm not judging you for it, Jon said, and meant it, because Jon of all men understood doing a dishonorable thing for a reason that felt like honor at the time. I'm saying it was the act of a man who followed his heart instead of his head, and I'm saying that the crossing of the Twins is not a place to do that again. That's all. Be the other Robb there, the cold one, the one who reads the board. Robb held his gaze. You sound like Mother, he said. Your mother is right about guest right being sacred, Jon said. I hope she's right. But guest right is a rule, Robb, and rules only stop men who believe in them. I don't know that Walder Frey believes in anything but Walder Frey. Robb was quiet for a long moment. I'll be careful, he said finally. At the Twins. I'll go in with my eyes open. But I'm crossing that river, Jon. I have to. The north is gone if I don't get home, and the only road home runs over Walder Frey's bridge. He rubbed his face. Sometimes the only road runs through the place you're afraid of. You learn that, being a king, you don't get to only take the safe roads. I know, Jon said. He did know. That was the worst of it. Robb was right. The army had to cross. There was no other bridge, and a king who refused every dangerous road would lose the war to his own caution. Jon could not point at a single thing and say this. Here. This is the trap. He could only feel the whole shape of it pressing in, and feeling was not enough to turn an army. Let me come with you, Jon said. Into the twins. At the wedding. Robb looked at him. You're a deserter, Jon. If Walder Frey recognizes you for a watchman who ran, then I'm a Stark man-at-arms with no name worth mentioning, Jon said. I'll keep the cloak plain. I'll keep my head down. I just want to be in the hall. I want to be where you are when you cross. He held Robb's gaze. Please, let me be there. Robb was quiet. All right, he said. You'll be in the hall. As a guardsman, stay close to the back and keep the wolf out of sight. Ghost in a Frey hall will start a fight before the soup's served. He almost smiled. It'll be good to have you there, even if you're wrong about all of it. Especially if you're wrong about all of it. I hope I'm wrong about all of it, Jon said. He did not think he was wrong about all of it. He just could not prove the part he was right about. The missing scouts. The scouts disappeared in the last week before the twins. It started small, the way these things did. The army had outriders, scouts who ranged ahead and to the flanks, screening the host's advance. The eyes that kept an army from walking blind into a thing. Jon had taken to riding with them when he could, partly to be useful, and partly because the scouts were the men most likely to see the shape of the country ahead. And the country ahead was where Jon's fear lived. 2 scouts went out on the western flank and did not come back. That happened. Scouts died, fell from horses, met enemy patrols, deserted, got lost. 2 missing scouts was not an event. The outrider captain logged it and sent 2 more, and the army moved on. Then a pair on the eastern flank did not come back. Then a single rider, a man Jon knew slightly, a Karstark man named Garth, who was good at his work, and not the kind to desert or get lost, went out toward the twins to confirm the road and the timing, and did not return. 3 losses in a week, all of them on the side of the army that faced the twins. Jon took it to the outrider captain, a weathered man named Hal who had been screening armies since before Jon was born. You've lost 3 in a week, Jon said. All east and west. None to the rear. Aye, Hal said. He did not seem to have thought about it the way Jon had. Bad luck. Country's thick with Lannister outriders and worse. Riverlands is a murdering place these days. 3 in a week, all toward the twins, none toward home. Hal looked at him. He was not a stupid man. Jon watched him do the arithmetic that Jon had already done, and watched him arrive where Jon had arrived, and watched him decide not to like it. You're saying someone's killing my scouts, Hal said. Killing the ones that ride toward the twins, so nobody comes back with a look at what's waiting there. I'm saying it's possible. It's possible the Lannisters have a strong patrol screen east of here too. That's also possible. More likely, even. Hal spat. I don't like losing men, but I've lost more than 3 in a worse week, and it didn't mean a lord was selling us. Sometimes the country just eats your scouts. And sometimes a man clears the road of eyes before he springs a trap, Jon said. Hal held his gaze for a moment. Aye, he admitted. Sometimes that too. He looked east, toward the twins. toward the country that had swallowed 3 of his men. "I'll send them in pairs. Tell them to turn back at the first sign, and not to be brave about it." He looked at Jon. "That's all I can do on a feeling, Snow. I can't tell the king to halt the army because the country's eating scouts. He'd want to know who and why. And you don't have a who or a why. You've got a bad feeling and a wolf that doesn't like Lord Bolton." "I know," Jon said. "It's not nothing," Hal said, not unkindly. "But it's not enough either. You know the difference, being a soldier. A feeling's not a fact." Jon knew the difference. That was the whole problem. He had feelings, plural, a growing pile of them. The Freys, Bolton, the messages, the scouts, Ghost's hackles, the wrongness he could feel pressing in from every direction. And not one of them was a fact. He could line them all up, and they made a shape, and the shape looked like a trap. But a man could not stop an army with a shape. A man needed a fact, a who, a why, a piece of paper, a confession, a body, something he could put in Robb's hand and say, "Here, this is real." He did not have it. The army marched toward the twins. Jon rode with it, watching the country eat scouts, feeling the shape press in, carrying his pile of feelings that were not facts, and knowing that somewhere ahead a castle was waiting with its doors open, and that he was going to walk into it beside his brother with nothing in his hands but a sword and a fear he could not prove. The doubt. Whether he was seeing a ghost. The worst nights were the ones where Jon thought he was mad. It would come on him in the dark, usually when the day's watching was done, and there was nothing to occupy the mind but the pile of things he had collected. The Freys, Bolton, the messages, the scouts, the wolf's hackles, and in the dark, the pile would suddenly look like nothing, like the imaginings of a guilty man. He would lie awake and turn it over and watch it come apart in his hands, every piece of it innocent on its own. And he would think, there is no conspiracy. There is a sour old lord who was insulted, and a cold lord who is cold by nature, and ravens that fly where ravens fly, and scouts the war ate the way war eats scouts, and a wolf that doesn't like a man because wolves don't like some men, and a deserter who broke his own faith and now sees broken faith in every shadow because he cannot bear to be the only oath-breaker in the world. That was the thought that frightened him most. Not that there was a trap, that there was not one, and that he was building it out of his own guilt, and that he might do something terrible because of a ghost his shame had conjured. Because what could he do if he believed it? He had thought about that, lying awake. If he truly believed Robb was riding into a trap, what was the action that belief demanded? He could not stop the army. He had no power to, and no proof to win it. He could keep warning Robb, and had, and the warnings landed on a brother who could not afford to believe them. He could, at the last, in the hall, draw a sword on a feeling, and if he was wrong, if it was all a deserter's ghost, then Jon Snow would draw steel at a wedding feast and start the very massacre he feared, would turn a tense peace into a bloodbath with his own madness, would be the thing that broke guessed right, because he could not tell a real shadow from one his guilt had made. That was the trap inside the trap. The doubt was not separate from the danger. The doubt was part of it. If he acted and was wrong, he was a murderer and a madman. If he did not act and was right, his brother died. And he could not tell, from inside his own head, which of those men he was about to be. He tried to test it. He tried to be a fair judge of his own evidence, the way his father would have been. He lined the pieces up and asked of each one, "Is this real, or am I making it real?" The Frey grievance was real. That was history, not feeling. Old Walder had been insulted, and Old Walder did not forgive. The missing scouts were real. 3 men, gone, all toward the twins. That was arithmetic, not imagination. Ghost's hackles were real, whatever they meant. The messages were real. He had watched the birds fly, It was only the meaning that he could not verify. Every piece was a real fact. It was the line connecting them that he could not prove was there. And a man can draw a line through any scatter of true points if he wants the line badly enough. He thought about going to Catelyn. She was the cleverest head in the camp, and she knew the Freys, and she had no reason to flatter a deserter's fears. If he laid it all out for her and she said it was nothing, he would have his answer, and could stop torturing himself. And if she said it was something, but he could not quite make himself do it, partly because she had never been anything but cold to him, and laying his deepest fear before her felt like handing a weapon to someone who had no reason to use it gently, and partly because he was afraid of the answer either way. If she dismissed it, he would not be able to stop fearing it anyway, and would only have proven himself a fool. And if she shared it, if Catelyn Stark, clever and clear-eyed and unfriendly to him, looked at his pile of feelings and went pale, then it was real, and his brother was riding to his death, and there was still nothing either of them could do to stop the army from crossing. In the end she came to him, and it was worse than anything he had imagined, because she did not dismiss it. But that was 2 nights before the twins, and Jon spent the nights before that one alone with the doubt, lying awake in the dark, unable to tell whether he was a soldier seeing a real danger or a broken man seeing the shape of his own guilt thrown huge against the wall of the world. He never did resolve it. That was the truth of it. The truth he would carry afterward, he never knew, not until the music changed in the hall, whether he was right or mad. He drew his sword in the great hall of the twins, not because he had become certain, but because he had run out of time to become certain. And a man who waits for certainty before he acts will, in this world, usually wait until it is too late to act at all. He guessed. At the last, with his brother's life in the balance, he guessed. He happened to guess right. He would spend years afterward thinking about the men who guessed wrong, the cautious men. The men who waited for proof. The men who did the reasonable thing and trusted guessed right and the welcome of their hosts, and died for it, in that hall and 1,000 halls across the history of the world. They had not been fools. They had simply required proof before they acted, the way reasonable men do. And the proof had come too late for all of them, the way it nearly came too late for Jon. The difference between Jon and the dead was not that he was wiser. It was that he had acted on a feeling he could not prove, half believing he was mad to do it. Sometimes that is the whole difference between the living and the dead. Not wisdom, just the willingness to move before you are sure. Catelyn. The conversation neither wanted. Catelyn Stark came to find him 2 nights before the twins. This was the thing Jon had not expected. In all his life, she had never sought him out. She had endured him, managed him, kept a cold distance that he had learned to read as the price of his existence in her house. She had never once come to him. And now she came to his fire in the dark, alone, with her cloak pulled close. And she stood at the edge of the light until Jon noticed her and stood. "My lady," he said. "Sit," she said. "Don't perform courtesy at me. We're past it." He sat. She sat across the fire from him, and Ghost lifted his head and looked at her, and she looked back at the wolf with the wariness of a woman who had never been comfortable with the Stark wolves and had her reasons. "You think there's a trap at the twins?" she said. "Yes. Robb told me what you said. About Walder Frey. About Bolton." She held her hands to the fire. "I came to tell you that you're not wrong to fear it, and to tell you that fearing it changes nothing." Jon waited. "I know Walder Frey," she said. "Better than my son does. I grew up at Tully, and the Freys are our bannermen, and I have known that grasping, spiteful old man my whole life. You're right about him. He was insulted, and he is the kind of man who does not forget an insult. And if there were a way for him to profit from our destruction without cost to himself, he would take it and feel righteous doing it." She looked at the fire. "You're right about all of it." Then, "And it changes nothing," she said again, "because the army must cross, because there is no other bridge. Because the North is lost if Robb does not get home, and the only road home runs over the twins. You've heard all this. It's still true. She held his gaze across the fire. I did not come to tell you you're wrong. I came to tell you you're right and it doesn't matter, so that you stop torturing yourself with the idea that if you only find the right fact, the right proof, you can make this safe. You can't. There is no safe. There is only the crossing, and the crossing is dangerous, and we do it anyway, because the alternative is worse. Jon looked at her across the fire. Then why are you telling me this? He said. She was quiet for a moment. Because you love him, she said. My son. You came 800 miles and broke the only oath you ever swore, because he was alone in the south and you couldn't bear it. I have spent your whole life resenting your existence and I am... She stopped. Her jaw worked. I am old enough now, and tired enough, to know the difference between a man who is a danger to my children and a man who would die for them. You are the second kind. I was wrong about you for a very long time, and I am not going to pretend I wasn't. And I am not going to ask your forgiveness for it, because I don't deserve it, and you don't owe it. But I am going to say this once, because we are about to walk into a place that may kill us all. If it goes wrong in that hall, if I am right and you are right, and that old man does the thing we both fear, you protect Robb. Not me, not the Lords, Robb. You get my son out of that hall alive, whatever it costs, whoever it costs. Do you understand me? Jon held her gaze across the fire. You're his mother, he said. If it comes to that, you or him. There is no me or him, Catelyn said. There is only him. I am a woman past her best years who has already lost a husband and 2 sons to this war. He is the king in the north and the last hope of everything Ned died for. If my life buys his, that is not a sacrifice. That is arithmetic, and it is the easiest sum I have ever done. She held his gaze with the fierce clarity of a mother who had made her peace with the worst thing. Promise me. Him first. Always him. Jon looked at the woman who had never loved him, who had just admitted she was wrong about him, who was asking him to let her die for her son if the moment came. I promise, he said. She nodded. Once. The bargain struck. She stood. You have his father's honor, she said, looking down at him. More than Robb does, truth be told. Robb has the fire. You have the other thing. The thing that does the right, hard thing when no one's watching. Ned had it. Her voice caught, very slightly, on the name. It cost him his head. I hope it cost you less. She walked back into the dark. Jon sat by the fire for a long time after she was gone. Ghost put his head on Jon's knee. Jon thought about honor. The thing he had thrown away at the wall. The thing Catelyn had just told him he still had more of than the true-born son. He did not feel like he had it. He felt like a deserter with a bad feeling and a wolf, riding toward a castle he was afraid of, carrying a promise to a woman who had spent his life being cold to him and had just asked him to watch her die. He did not sleep that night. He watched the fire, and he thought about the hall they were riding toward, and he tried, one more time, to find the fact that would let him stop it. He could not find it. The twins. What Jon saw when they arrived. The high come. The twins were 2 castles, one on each bank, joined by a bridge wide enough to ride an ox cart across, with a great arched gatehouse, the water tower, at the bridge's centre. They were ugly, the way fortresses built for use and not for beauty were ugly, squat and grey and strong, and they had stood astride the Green Fork for 600 years, collecting tolls from everyone who needed to cross. And that was the whole story of House Frey in one structure. They had built a bridge and grown fat on the fact that everyone needed it. The Northern Army made camp on the near bank. That was the first thing Jon marked. And it was a good thing Robb had listened, at least this far. The host did not cross. The bulk of the army stayed on the near bank, in the field below the western castle, and only the wedding party would cross to the eastern castle for the feast. Robb, Catelyn, Edmure the groom, the senior lords, and their guardsmen. The army stayed where it could not be trapped. It was the cautious choice, the cold Robb choice, and Jon was glad of it. But it was not enough, and Jon knew it was not enough, because the wedding party was the prize. You did not need to trap the whole army if you could behead it, kill the king and his mother and his uncle and his chief lords at the feast, and the army on the far bank became 18,000 men with no head, leaderless, and you could deal with a headless army at your leisure. Jon rode in with the wedding party as a guardsman. He wore plain mail and a plain cloak, and he kept his head down, and he left Ghost chained in the camp on the near bank, which he hated, because the wolf in a Frey hall would start a war before the feast began. Catelyn had been right about that, but leaving Ghost behind felt like leaving his own eyes behind. The wolf had strained at the chain when Jon left him. The wolf had known something. Ghost always knew. The twins felt wrong the moment Jon rode under the gatehouse. He could not have said why exactly, and that was the maddening thing. There was no one detail he could point at. It was the accumulation. The Frey men on the walls were too many for a wedding, and too few for a garrison expecting a fight. Just the number you wanted if you were hiding a force. The faces were wrong. The Freys received their guests with smiles that did not reach the eyes. The smiles of men performing welcome they did not feel. And Jon had learned to read that exact smile on 100 faces in 100 halls. The yard had carts in it. Covered carts. More than a wedding feast required. And Jon thought about what you might hide under a cart's cover and did not like the thinking. And the music. There were musicians in the gallery above the great hall. Jon marked them when the party was led in, the way you marked everything in a room you were afraid of. There were a great many of them for a wedding in a minor castle, and they did not look like musicians. They looked like men holding instruments. There is a difference, and Jon had spent enough years around fighting men to see it. Musicians held their instruments the way a tool sits in a craftsman's hand, easy and unconsidered. These men held theirs the way a soldier holds a weapon he is pretending is not a weapon. Jon looked at the gallery for a long time. He thought, crossbows, under the floor of that gallery, or in those instrument cases, or both. He thought, that is where the killing starts. From above. They'll seal the doors, and the men in the gallery will fire down into a packed hall where no one can fight back. He could not prove it. He still could not prove a single thing. But he was inside it now, and the time for proof was running out, and Jon Snow stood against the wall of the great hall of the twins in a borrowed guardsman's mail, and did the only thing left to a man who had run out of time to find facts. He started planning for the worst. The feast. The last hour before. Old Walder Frey received them from his high seat, and the sight of him settled something cold and final in Jon's gut. He was ancient, past 90, a wattled, weak-eyed, foul-mouthed old man who looked like he should not have had the strength to nurse a grudge, let alone spring a trap. But his eyes were not weak. Jon watched the old man's eyes move over the wedding party, over Robb, over Catelyn, over Edmure the groom, and the eyes were sharp and cold and pleased. The eyes of a man who was enjoying a private joke, and Jon knew the joke, or thought he knew it, and could not prove it. The bread and salt were brought out. Jon watched Robb take the bread and eat it. He watched Catelyn take the salt. Guessed right. The ancient law. The thing Catelyn had staked everything on. The rule that said once a guest had eaten at a host's table, the host could not harm him without damning himself before gods and men forever. The bread went around. The wedding party ate the Freys' bread and salt under the Freys' roof, and Catelyn caught Jon's eye across the hall, and her look said, "There, you see, we are guests now. We are protected. The old law holds." Jon did not believe the old law would hold. He had watched Walder Frey's face while the bread was served. The old man had served guest right with the bored ritual of a man performing a formality he did not respect, and a man who did not respect guest right was a man who would break it, because guest right only bound those who believed in it. Catelyn believed in it. Walder Frey believed in nothing but Walder Frey. The feast began. It was a poor feast for a wedding. Thin soup, tough mutton, sour wine, the deliberate insult of a host who was performing welcome while withholding it. The northern lords ate it because they were guests, and because they were hungry, and because they did not see what Jon saw. Edmure was married to his Frey girl, Roslyn, a pretty, frightened thing who wept through her own wedding, and Jon watched her weep and thought, "She knows. That girl knows what's coming. And she's weeping because she's about to watch men die over her marriage, and she can't say a word." That was nearly enough. The bride's tears. But a frightened bride wept at half the weddings in Westeros, and a man could not draw a sword on a hall full of lords because the bride looked sad. Jon worked the room with his eyes. He counted the exits. 2 doors, the main doors at the hall's foot, and a smaller door behind the high table. He counted the Frey men along the walls, more than a feast needed. He marked the gallery and the false musicians. He found the places where the killing would come from, and the places a man might run to, and he positioned himself near the smaller door behind the high table, the door nearest Robb, because his promise to Catelyn was him first, always him. And if it came, it would come fast, and Jon needed to be close. Twice during the feast, Jon nearly acted on nothing. The first time was when the doors at the hall's foot were pulled most of the way closed, for the draft, a servant said, and Jon's whole body went tight, because a hall with its doors closed is a hall a man cannot run from. He had his hand on his sword before he made himself stop. Doors got closed against drafts. It meant nothing, or it meant everything, and he could not tell which, and he could not draw steel on a door. The second time was when he saw a Frey servant murmur something to a man by the wall, and the man slipped out the small door, and Jon thought, "That's the signal. That's the runner going to ready the crossbowman." And then the man came back a minute later, doing up his breeches, having only gone to make water. And Jon stood against the wall with his heart slamming, and understood that he was now seeing the trap in everything, in draughts and full bladders, that the fear had reached the point where it would read murder into a man pissing. That frightened him as much as the Freys did. He was losing the ability to tell the signs from the noise. Every nerve was screaming, and half of what it screamed at was nothing, and somewhere in the nothing was the one real thing, and he was going to have to catch it in the instant it came, not a moment before, when he would be acting on a draft, and not a moment after, when his brother would be dead. He found a server he half trusted. A frightened river boy pressed into Frey's service, and under the noise of the feast he said, "Lo, the musicians. Up in the gallery. Are they Lord Frey's own players?" The boy's eyes flicked up to the gallery and back, and he went a shade paler, and he said nothing, and the saying nothing was the loudest thing Jon had heard all night. He started to move off. Jon caught his sleeve. "When does it start?" Jon breathed. The boy looked at him with the wide, terrified eyes of someone who knew exactly what was coming, and had no power to stop it. When they play the Lannister song, the boy whispered, "Please, I never told you," and he pulled free and vanished into the press of servants. It was the closest thing to proof Jon had gotten in 100 miles. A frightened boy's whisper. Not enough to stop a wedding, not enough to draw a sword on a hall full of lords, but enough, finally, mercifully enough, to tell Jon the one thing he most needed. the trigger. When they play the Lannister song. Jon thought about Ghost, chained on the near bank, and wished with everything in him that the wolf were here. Ghost would have smelled the killing before it came, would have given them more than a half second. But a direwolf in a Frey hall would have sprung the trap early, before Robb was near an exit. Leaving the wolf behind had been right. It still felt like fighting blind. He found Robb's eye once, across the hall. He did not signal. There was no signal to give. He just looked at his brother, the king in the north, eating bad mutton at his uncle's wedding, the crown off his head for the feast, looking tired and young and unaware. And Jon tried to put everything into the look, all the warning he could not prove. And Robb met his eyes and gave him a small tired smile, the smile of a brother saying, "You see, it's fine. Nothing's happening. You were afraid of a feast." Then Robb looked away, and the music changed. Jon had been waiting for it without knowing he was waiting for it. The musicians in the gallery had been playing wedding songs badly, and then they stopped, and there was a pause, and then they began a different tune, slow and low and wrong for a feast, a marching tune, a dirge. Jon knew the song. Every northern and river man in the hall knew the song. It was the Rains of Castamere, the song the Lannisters played for the houses they destroyed, and Jon understood that he had run out of time. He saw, in the same instant, several things happen at once. He saw Catelyn's face change. She knew the song too. She understood what it meant. And Jon watched the understanding hit her a half second after it hit him. He saw the great doors at the foot of the hall begin to swing shut. He saw the men in the gallery reach into their instrument cases. He saw Walder Frey's mouth twist into a smile. He saw Roose Bolton, at the high table, lean back away from the table's edge, the small, careful movement of a man getting himself clear of the killing ground. And Jon Snow, who had no proof, who had never had proof, who had ridden 100 miles on a feeling that was not a fact, stopped waiting to be sure. He drew his sword. Robb. He roared, across the hall, over the music. Down. Get down. And the hall erupted. The hall. The first moments. Jon's shout bought them half a heartbeat, and half a heartbeat was everything. The crossbowmen in the gallery had been waiting for a signal, the song, probably, or a gesture from Walder Frey, and they had been waiting to fire into a hall of seated, relaxed, unsuspecting men. Jon's roar turned the hall from seated to moving in the instant before the bolts came, and a moving target is a different thing entirely from a still one, and men who throw themselves down at a shout do not die, the way men who are sitting still do. The first volley came. It was bad. Jon would remember it as the worst thing he had ever seen, and he had seen a great deal. The bolts coming down out of the gallery into the packed hall, the sound of iron going into men, the screaming starting. Northern lords died in that first volley, men who had been a half second too slow to heed the shout, men who had been laughing or drinking or simply not understanding. Dacey Mormont went down, the small Jon. Good men, dying in the first breath of it, but not all of them. Robb had moved. Jon's shout had reached him, and Ned Stark had raised his children to react to their brother's voice without waiting to ask why. And Robb had thrown himself sideways off the bench in the instant Jon roared, and the bolt that would have taken him in the chest took him in the shoulder instead, high, through meat, not through the heart. Catelyn had moved too, toward Robb, not away, a mother's reflex faster than thought. And Jon was already crossing the hall. He had positioned himself by the small door behind the high table for exactly this, and he was moving before the first bolt landed, sword out, going for Robb. A Frey man-at-arms came at him from the wall, and Jon killed him without slowing, a thing he would not have been able to do a year ago, kill a man without breaking stride. But the wall and the road and the war had made him into a thing that could. And then he was at the high table and hauling Robb up by his good arm. "The door," Jon said. "Behind the table. Move." Robb was bleeding, and the bolt was still in his shoulder, and his face was white with shock and pain. But he was the king in the north, and he was Ned Stark's son, and he moved. Catelyn was there, on Robb's other side, getting him up, and the three of them went for the small door behind the high table, while the hall turned into a slaughterhouse behind them. The Great Jon was holding the main doors. Jon saw it as he ran. The huge man had gotten to the great doors before the Freys could bar them fully, and he was holding them, a giant of a man with a bench in his hands wielded like a club, buying time with his body so that whoever could run, could. Other Northmen rallied to him. The hall was not a clean slaughter anymore. It was a battle, an ugly, desperate, close-quarters battle. Northmen and rivermen fighting for their lives against Freys, who had expected to do murder and were now doing war. That was the thing Jon's half-second had bought. Not safety, a fight. The Red Wedding had been designed as an execution, and Jon had turned it into a battle. And in a battle, men had a chance, where in an execution they had none. The small door behind the high table opened onto a passage. Jon went through first, sword ready, Robb behind him with Catelyn supporting him, and the passage was dark and narrow, and Jon's whole body was waiting for it to be full of Freymen, because if Walder Frey was clever, he would have put men here, on the obvious escape route. Walder Frey was clever. There were men in the passage. The passage. What it cost to get through. Four of them, in the dark of the passage, waiting. Jon killed the first before the man fully understood that the people coming through the door were fighting back rather than fleeing in panic. The second was harder, a real fighter, a Frey captain who knew his work, and Jon traded blows with him in the narrow dark while Robb and Catelyn pressed against the wall behind him, and Jon took a cut across the forearm that he did not feel until later and put his sword through the man's throat and wrenched it free. Two left, and the passage was narrow, and Jon was one man, and behind him Robb could barely lift a sword with his bolt-pierced shoulder. Catelyn picked up the dead captain's blade. Jon did not see her do it. He was fighting the third man, but he heard it, the scrape of steel on stone, and then Catelyn Stark was beside him in the passage with a sword in her hands that she barely knew how to hold. And she was not skilled. She was a lady of 50 who had never trained at arms, but she was between the fourth Freyman and her son, and she swung the heavy blade with both hands and all the fury of a mother, and it was enough to make the man flinch, and the flinch was enough for Jon to kill the third man and turn and kill the fourth before he recovered. The passage was clear. For a moment, the four of them stood in the dark and the noise, Jon, Robb, Catelyn, and the passage full of the dead, and breathed, and the battle roared on in the hall behind them. The horses, Catelyn said. This passage runs to the postern. There'll be horses in the yard if we're fast. She was a Tully, she knew castles, she knew the twins better than any of them. Go, both of you. Go, you're coming, Robb said. I'm coming. Move, they moved. The passage ran down and turned, and Jon led with his bloody sword, and they came out into a small yard between the inner and outer walls, and there were horses, picketed mounts, the Freys' own, and Jon got Robb onto one despite the shoulder, and swung up onto another, and turned to Catelyn, and the yard was filling with Freymen. They came from the outer gate and from a door in the inner wall, a dozen of them, more, men who had been posted to the yard for exactly this, to catch anyone who made it through the passage. Jon saw the whole shape of it in an instant. They were not going to make it out clean. The yard was too open, the Freys too many, and Robb was barely able to hold his reins with one arm. Catelyn saw it too. She did not have a horse yet. She was on foot. In the yard, the heavy sword still in her hands, and the Freymen were between her and the last horse, and there was no time for her to fight through them, no time for Jon to cut a path, no time for anything but the thing she had already decided 2 nights ago by Jon's fire. She looked at Jon. Him first. Always him. Go, she screamed. Get him out. Go. And Catelyn Stark turned and threw herself at the Frey men with a sword she did not know how to use. and she did not do it to win. Because there was no winning it, she did it to make them deal with her, to make a dozen armed men turn toward the screaming woman with the blade instead of toward the king in the north on the horse, to buy with her body the seconds her son needed. Mother. Robb screamed. Jon grabbed Robb's reins. It was the worst thing he ever did. He would carry it the rest of his life, grabbing his brother's reins and hauling both horses toward the postern gate, while behind them Catelyn Stark went down under the Frey swords, screaming her son's name, dying so that her son could live, exactly as she had told Jon by the fire she would. Mother. Jon. No, Mother, she told me to, Jon said, the words torn out of him, hauling the horses through the gate. Robb. She made me promise. She made me promise. And then they were through the postern and into the dark beyond the walls, and the twins were behind them, burning now, the great hall lit up with fire and full of the dead. And Catelyn Stark was in it. And they were not. And that was the whole terrible arithmetic of it. She had bought it. With her life. Exactly as she said she would. They rode hard in the dark, away from the walls, 2 horses and 2 brothers, and the fire of the twins throwing their shadows long ahead of them across the broken ground. Robb was trying to turn his horse. Even wounded, even with the bolt in his shoulder and the blood running down his arm, he was hauling at the reins, trying to turn back toward the castle, toward his mother, and Jon had to ride knee to knee with him and keep a hand on his bridle to stop him. Let go, Robb was saying. Jon, let go, she's back there. Let go of my horse, she's gone. Robb, you don't know that. You don't. Let go. She made me promise. Jon shouted it over the hoofbeats and the distant screaming. 2 nights ago, at my fire, she came to me. She made me swear. You first. Always you, whatever it cost. Whoever it cost. She knew, Robb. She'd already decided. The moment it went wrong, she was always going to do exactly what she did. And she made me the one who'd hold you to it because she knew you'd never let her, and she knew I would. Because I keep the promises His voice cracked apart. Because I keep the ones I haven't already broken. She used the last of my honor to die for you. Don't make me have broken it for nothing. Robb stopped pulling at the reins. He rode in the dark with his face turned back toward the burning castle, and he did not turn the horse. And the not turning was the hardest thing Jon had ever watched a man do. Harder than any wound, harder than any battle. A son riding away from his mother's death because his mother had arranged it so he could not do otherwise. She came to your fire, Robb said. His voice was strange, flattened. She went to you. Not to me. To you. Yes. Why you? Because you'd have argued, Jon said. Because you'd have refused to hear it, refused to plan for it, told her guest right would hold and the welcome was real. And because she needed someone who'd do the cold thing in the moment without freezing. She didn't trust you to leave her, Robb. She loved you too much to trust you with her death. She trusted me. Because she'd finally decided I was the kind of man who'd keep a terrible promise. Jon's throat was raw. It's the only thing she ever trusted me with. And it was that. Robb made a sound that wasn't weeping and was worse than weeping. They rode on into the dark, away from the fire. 2 of the wolves of Winterfell carrying the cost of the night between them, and behind them the twins burned. And Catelyn Stark was in the burning, and she had spent herself exactly as she meant to, and there was nothing either of them could do now but live, because living was the thing she had bought, and the only way left to honor the buying. Jon got his brother out of the dark and did not let him turn around. The near bank. What was left of the army? The army on the near bank had not been idle. This was the second thing Jon's warning had brought, though he had not planned it, and could not have planned it. The plan, the Freys plan, the Lannister plan, had 2 parts. Murder the king and his lords at the feast, and at the same time fall upon the leaderless army in its camp. The Freys and whatever Bolton men would turn their cloaks attacking the Northmen while they slept off the wedding wine. Behead the host and butcher the body, both at once. But the body had not been sleeping. Jon had not been the only one with a bad feeling. The outrider captain, Hal, had not been able to act on Jon's fears, could not halt an army on a feeling, but he had not forgotten them either. And when the missing scouts and the wrong-feeling castle had added to Jon's words in his weathered old soldier's mind, he had done the one thing a scout captain could do without orders. He had kept his men awake and watching on the near bank through the night of the feast. So when the Freys on the near bank moved against the camp, when the killing in the hall was meant to be matched by killing in the field, the camp was not asleep. It was watching. And an army that is watching is a very different thing from an army that is surprised. The Great Jon's brother held the camp. The northern lords who had stayed with the host rallied it. The Frey attack on the near bank, which had been meant as a massacre, became a battle. And the Northmen outnumbered the Freys badly on the open field. And a battle between 18,000 wakeful Northmen and a few thousand Freys who had expected to butcher sleeping men was not a battle at all. It was a reckoning. By the time Jon and Robb reached the near bank, coming around through the dark, crossing at a ford Catelyn had told them of in her last useful breath, the near bank camp was theirs. The Freys who had crossed to attack were dead or fleeing. The northern army, bloodied and enraged and grieving, was very much alive. And it had 2 wolves. Ghost had broken his chain when the killing started. Jon learned that later, the wolf had felt it, the way the wolf felt everything, had broken the chain and torn through the camp toward the bridge, toward Jon. And the Freys who had tried to stop a direwolf in the dark had learned what a direwolf was. Ghost found Jon at the ford and came out of the dark and pressed his huge head against Jon's chest, and Jon put his arms around the wolf's neck and held on, and for a moment let himself feel all of it, the relief and the grief and the horror, the brother saved and the mother lost. Grey Wind lived too, and that was its own small mercy, bought the same way as everything else that night, barely, and at a cost. Robb had not been allowed to bring the wolf into the wedding hall. The Freys had insisted, and Robb, trying to mend the breach, had agreed to have Grey Wind penned in the kennels for the feast. It was meant to be the wolf's death. In Cannon's shape of the night, a caged direwolf was a slaughtered one, crossbows through the bars, while the beast could not reach the men who killed it. But the killing in the hall had begun a half-second early, on Jon's shout, and the chaos had run ahead of the Freys' plan, and in the confusion the wolf had thrown himself at the pen's gate again and again until the old wood gave, and Grey Wind had come out of the kennels into the yard like a grey death and made for his master through a castle that had become a battlefield. He reached the near bank bloodied, a crossbow bolt in his flank, but alive, and when he found Robb in the mud, the king in the north put his arms around his wolf's neck and wept into the grey fur, because the wolf had lived when his mother had not, and the gods of the north were cruel in exactly that way, giving you the thing you loved back with one hand while they took the thing you loved more with the other. Then Jon let go of Ghost, because Robb needed him. Robb was off his horse and on his knees in the mud of the near bank. Grey Wind pressed against him, looking back across the river at the burning castle, and he was making a sound that Jon had never heard him make, the sound of a man who has just understood the price of his own life. "She's in there," Robb said. "She's still in there, Jon. We have to go back. We have to." "She's gone, Robb. We don't know that. She's gone." Jon got down in the mud beside his brother and took him by the shoulders, careful of the wound. "She bought this. She bought you. Do you understand me? She came to me 2 nights ago, and she made me swear. You first. Always you. Whatever it cost. She knew. She'd already decided. The moment it went wrong in that hall, she was always going to do what she did." Jon's voice broke. "Don't make it for nothing. She didn't die so you could go back in there and die too. She died so you'd live. Live. Robb looked at him. The king in the north, kneeling in the mud, his shoulder bleeding. His mother burning in the castle across the river, his face a ruin. I never even... Robb stopped. The last thing I did was look away from you. In the hall, you tried to warn me and I smiled and looked away and went back to my mutton. You knew the whole time, and I... His voice cracked. Why didn't I listen? Why does no one ever listen? Until it's bodies. Because a feeling isn't a fact, Jon said. The words Hal had said to him, the words that had been true the whole way here, the words that were the heart of the whole terrible thing. I couldn't prove it. I couldn't make you believe it. I couldn't make anyone believe it. I'm not. He stopped. It almost wasn't enough, Robb. I almost wasn't enough. Half a second later, and you'd be dead too. It was that close. It's always going to have been that close. Robb wept. Jon held him, in the mud of the near bank, with the castle burning across the water, and the army of the north alive around them, and Catelyn Stark dead inside the fire, and the two brothers grieved the woman who had saved them, one of them her son, and one of them the boy she had never loved and had asked, at the end, to be the instrument of her sacrifice. Ghost stood over them both and watched the fire. The Count, who lived and who did not. The Dawn Count was a butcher's bill, and Jon stood through all of it, because a man who has caused a thing should look at the whole of what he caused. That was how he thought of it, in the grey light, that he had caused this. Not the trap. The Freys and the Boltons and the Lannisters had built the trap. But the battle, the open fighting, the dead in the hall, that had come from his shout, his drawn sword, his second of warning. If he had stayed silent, the wedding party would have died quietly, murdered, all of them, with no chance to fight. Because he had shouted, some had lived, and some had died fighting who would have died anyway, and the hall had become a battlefield instead of an execution ground. It was better. He knew it was better. A chance to fight was better than no chance, and the men who lived had lived because of the warning. But better was not the same as good, and the Count was terrible regardless. Daisy Mormont was dead. She had taken a bolt in the first volley before the warning fully reached her, a fierce woman cut down at a wedding feast. Mage Mormont, her mother, had lived, and the grief on the old warrior woman's face was a thing Jon could not look at directly. The small Jon Umber was dead, the Great Jon's son, dead covering other men's escape, and the Great Jon himself half broken with the loss even as he held himself up on his spear and gave orders. Lord Karstark had lived. The grim man who would not speak to Jon found him in the dawn after the Count and looked at him for a long moment with his hard, cold eyes. You shouted, Karstark said. I did. You saw it coming. The deserter saw it coming and the lords did not. Something worked in the grim face. Not warmth. Karstark had no warmth left in him, but a grudging recalibration. I named you Oathbreaker in my heart and would not speak to you. And you are the reason I am drawing breath in this dawn instead of lying in that hall. He was silent a moment. I do not know what to do with that. A man who broke his oath, who saw true when the honest men saw nothing. It does not fit the world as I understand it. Honest men trusted guest right, Jon said. It was the right thing to trust. It only failed because the men across the table had no honor at all. That's not a failure of the honest men, my lord. It's just the world being worse than they were. Karstark looked at him. Your father would have trusted guest right, Karstark said, and died in that hall. Yes, Jon said quietly. He would have. And he did die. in a different hall, for trusting that men would honor what they swore. My father was a better man than me. It got him killed. I'm a worse man than him, an oathbreaker, a deserter, and it kept my brother alive. He held Karstark's gaze. I don't know what to do with that either, my lord. I've been trying not to think about what it means. Karstark was silent for a long moment. It means the gods are crueler than we tell our children, he said finally. And he walked away. And it was the longest Rickard Karstark had ever spoken to him. And it was not forgiveness exactly, but it was something. And Jon took it. Because in that dawn, he would take any small mercy he could get. The river lords had lost men. The northern lords had lost men. The wedding party had ridden into the twins perhaps 200 strong, and walked out perhaps half that. And the half that walked out had only done so because of a deserter's shout, and a giant holding a door, and a mother who threw herself on Frey swords in a castle yard. It was a victory. The histories would call it a victory. The night the Red Wedding turned on the men who planned it. It did not feel like a victory to the men who stood in the dawn counting their dead. It felt like surviving something that should have killed them all, which is a different thing entirely, and leaves a different mark. Jon stood through the whole count. Then he went to find his brother, who had not yet been told the full bill, and who would have to be, because he was the king, and a king does not get to look away from what his crown costs. Roose Bolton, the man who got away. Roose Bolton was gone. That was the discovery that hardened the whole night into something colder than grief. When the northern lords took account of the dead and the living in the grey dawn after the burning, when they counted who had died in the hall and who had died in the field and who had escaped through which gate, there was a name that belonged to none of the lists. Roose Bolton, Lord of the Dreadfort, Robb's most senior commander, had been at the high table when the music changed. And he was not among the dead, and he was not among the saved, and no man could say with certainty when he had left the hall or how. But Jon could say. Jon had seen it, the small, careful movement, Bolton leaning back from the table's edge in the instant before the killing. A man getting himself clear of a thing he knew was coming. Jon had seen it and had not had time to understand it in the chaos, and now in the dawn it came back to him with terrible clarity. Roose Bolton had known. Roose Bolton had been part of it. The Pale Lord had sat at the high table eating Frey bread and known that the crossbows were coming, and he had positioned himself to survive it. And when the slaughter began, he had slipped out in the confusion to a place the Freys had agreed to leave open for him. He had been a conspirator, the thing Ghost had smelled, the thing Jon had watched and could not prove. All of it had been true, every cold instinct, every hackle the wolf had raised, and the proof had come only now, in the one moment Jon would have given anything to be wrong. Written in the empty space at the high table where a traitor had been sitting. He's run for the Dreadfort, the Gratien said. The huge man had survived the doors, bloodied, a forearm broken, but alive, holding himself up on a spear like a staff. Or for the Lannisters. Either way he's run, and a man only runs from a thing he's guilty of. He sold us, said Mage Mormont, whose daughter Daisy had died in the first volley. Her voice was iron. He sold us to the Freys, and the Freys to the Lannisters, and he sat at the high table to watch it done, and he ran when it went wrong. She looked at Robb. Your Grace. The Dreadfort is the second strongest castle in the north. If Roose Bolton reaches it and shuts his gates, we'll be years digging him out. Robb sat on an overturned cart, his shoulder bound, his face grey. He had not spoken much since the ford. The crown was gone, lost in the hall, or in the fire, the bronze and iron circlet of the kings of winter melted or buried, and he sat bareheaded in the dawn like a man who was no longer sure he was a king at all. But when he spoke, the voice was a king's. Then we don't let him reach it, Robb said. He stood. The lords looked at him, what was left of them, the Greatjon and Mage Mormont and the Blackfish and the others who had lived, a council of the bloodied and the grieving. And Jon watched his brother gather himself, watched the fire come back into him. The thing Catelyn had named, The thing that made men follow Robb Stark into hopeless places. "Listen to me," Robb said. "All of you. Last night the Freys broke guest right. They murdered their guests under their own roof, with their own bread and salt in our bellies. There is no crime more black in all the laws of gods and men. Every house in Westeros that hears of it will know the Freys for what they are: oath-breakers, kinslayers of the sacred bond, men with no honor and no faith. The Freys have made themselves hated by every lord who keeps the old laws. That is a weapon. We will use it. And Bolton," the great Jon said. "Bolton is worse than the Freys," Robb said, "because Bolton is one of ours. A northern lord who sold the north. When the Northmen learn what he did, and they will learn, I'll see to it that every holdfast from the neck to the wall knows the name Roose Bolton and what it bought with our blood. The North will not shelter him. He'll have the Dreadfort and his own household men and nothing else, because no Northman with honor will stand beside the lord who sold the king at a wedding." Robb's jaw set. "We ride him down before he reaches his walls. The Frey lands are open to us now. Their men are dead in the hall and the field. Old Walder's strength is broken. We take the crossing. We take it for good. And we run Roose Bolton to ground before he can shut a gate between us." Jon listened to his brother and heard something he had not heard before. Robb had always been a good battle commander, quick, bold, brilliant on the field. But this was different. This was a man who had just learned, at the cost of his mother's life, what the cold reading of the board was worth, and who was doing it now, grief and all, turning the catastrophe into a campaign. It was the cold Robb that Jon had begged him to be at the Twins. He had become it, one night too late to save his mother. But he had become it. That was its own kind of grief, and Jon felt it watching, and said nothing. The Twins. The reckoning with Walder Frey. They took the Twins by midday. There was not much left to take. The Freys had spent their strength on the slaughter, and the slaughter had become a battle, and the battle had gone against them, and what remained in the two castles by the Green Fork was a broken household, old men, women, children, the servants, and Walder Frey himself, who hadn't run because he was too old to run and had not expected to need to. They found the old man in his high seat. He had not moved from it. He sat in the great hall that still stank of smoke and the dead, surrounded by the bodies of the wedding that had been meant to be his triumph, and he looked at the Northman coming through the doors with his sharp, cold, weak-eyed face, and he was afraid, and he was trying not to show it, and the trying was the most human thing about him. Robb walked into the hall where his mother had died. Jon walked beside him. He had tried to talk Robb out of it. The hall was a charnel house, full of the men who had died in the first volley, and somewhere in it, in the fire damage and the dead, was Catelyn. But Robb had needed to walk into it, and Jon had understood the need, and had gone with him so that he would not walk into it alone. They found her near the high table. Jon would not describe afterward to anyone what the Freys had done to Catelyn Stark's body after she died. He saw it, and Robb saw it, and it was a thing that could not be unseen. And Jon understood in that moment a piece of why men became the things they became in wars, because there are sights that take something out of a man and do not give it back. Robb knelt by his mother's body in the ruined hall and did not weep this time. The weeping was past. What was in his face now was colder and worse than weeping. Then he stood, and he turned to Walder Frey. "Lord Frey," Robb said. The old man's mouth worked. "I, the king in the north. Heh, still a king, are you? Thought we'd settled that. Thought my boys had settled it." His weak eyes darted to the Northman filling the hall, the dead Freys, the broken thing his trap had become. It wasn't, you can't hold an old man to account for. It was the Lannisters. It was Lord Tywin. He made the offer. He and the Bolton. What's an old man to do when the hand of the king? You served us bread and salt, Robb said, under your own roof, and then you murdered your guests. Guest right is, it's just words, boy. It's just old words. The strong have never truly. It is the oldest law there is, Robb said. Older than the Andals. Older than the first men's kings. When a man eats at your table, he is safe at your table. Because if that is not true, then no man is ever safe anywhere. And we are all just beasts in the dark, waiting to be murdered over our supper. You broke the law that lets men trust each other. You broke it for spite and a Lannister's coin. And you did it to my mother in this hall an hour ago. Robb's voice did not rise. That was the terrible part. Jon had expected fire and got ice. There is no punishment the law provides for what you did, because the men who wrote the law could not imagine a creature low enough to need one. So I will make my own. Walder Frey died in his high seat. Jon did not watch the doing of it. He had killed many men by then and would kill more. But the execution of a 90-year-old man, however much the old man had earned it, was not a thing Jon needed to carry, and he had carried enough that night. He turned away. He heard it. That was enough. When it was done, Robb stood in the hall of the twins, bareheaded, his mother dead behind him and the man who killed her dead before him, the king in the north, who had lived when he was meant to die, and he did not look like a man who had won anything. House Frey is finished, Robb said to the hall. Their name dies here. The crossing is the North's now, and the river lords. Take the castles, take the bridge, and send ravens. Send ravens to every corner of the 7 kingdoms, telling them what House Frey did, and what became of House Frey for the doing of it. Let every lord who ever thinks of breaking guest right remember the twins. He looked at the dead old man. That's all the Freys are good for now. A warning. The Northmen took the twins, and Jon Snow stood in the smoke and the dead and understood that they had won, that the thing he had ridden 100 miles to prevent had been prevented, that Robb was alive, that the trap had been turned, that against all the weight of how it should have gone, the king in the north had walked out of the red wedding breathing, and it did not feel like winning. It felt like the most expensive thing he had ever been part of. The pursuit. Running down the traitor. Roose Bolton ran for the Dreadfort and did not reach it. He had a head start, a night, gained by his careful early exit from the hall, and he had a hard core of Dreadfort men who had been in on the treachery and ridden out with him, perhaps 200 horse, riding hard for the north and the safety of the strongest walls in the land short of Winterfell itself. But the north turned against him exactly as Robb had said it would. Robb's ravens flew faster than Bolton's horses. The word went ahead of the traitor to every holdfast, every village, every lord between the twins and the Dreadfort. Roose Bolton sold the king at a wedding, broke guest right, murdered Lady Catelyn, and rides now for his castle. The king in the north names him traitor and kinslayer of the sacred bond. Shelter him and share his crime. And the north, which had loved Ned Stark and loved Ned Stark's son and held the old laws sacred the way only the north still did, closed against Roose Bolton like a fist. Holdfast that should have fed his horses barred their gates. Villages that should have hidden their grain burned it rather than let him have it. The crossing he needed at the Weeping Water was held against him by a minor house that had lost 3 sons in Robb's war and would sooner die than aid the man who had betrayed it. Roose Bolton, who had spent his whole cold life understanding that fear was more reliable than love, discovered that the North's love for the Starks was a kind of fear too, the fear of being the house that sheltered the man who broke guest right, and it closed every road home to him. Robb ran him down at the edge of the Bolton lands, within sight of the Dreadfort's towers, close enough that Roose Bolton could see his own walls and not reach them. Jon was there. The fight was short and ugly. Bolton's men were good and desperate, and they knew there was no surrender for them, that the king in the north would hang every man who had a hand in the Red Wedding, and so they fought the way men fight when running and yielding are both death. But they were 200, and Robb had brought 2,000, and the end was not in doubt, only the cost. Roose Bolton did not die fighting. That was not his way. When his men were broken around him and the thing was lost, the Pale Lord lowered his sword and sat his horse with the strange flat calm he had carried through everything, and waited for the Starks to take him, because a man who has run out of moves does not waste himself on a gesture. They brought him before Robb. The two men looked at each other, the young king who should have died at the Twins, and the cold lord who had arranged the dying. Jon stood close, hand on his sword, watching Bolton's pale eyes, because a man like Bolton was dangerous until he was dead, and sometimes after. "You knew," Robb said. "You sat at the table and you knew. You leaned back. My brother saw you lean back." Bolton's pale eyes moved to Jon. The flat assessment, even now. "The bastard," Bolton said, "with the wolf." Something that was almost respect passed across the cold face. "I wondered about you. The wolf never liked me. Animals know things men talk themselves out of." He looked back at Robb. "Yes, I knew. I made the arrangement. Lord Tywin offered the north, the wardenship, the Dreadfort raised above Winterfell, everything my house lost 1,000 years ago, in exchange for one wedding. It was a good bargain. It would have worked." The pale eyes were unbothered, analytical, a man reviewing a failed transaction. "It did not work because of a bastard's feeling and a wolf's nose. I have spent my life trusting calculation over instinct. It seems I was wrong about the weight of instinct. A useful thing to learn. A pity I have no time left to use it." "You have no time left at all," Robb said. "No," Bolton agreed. "I don't suppose I do." Robb took his head himself, with a borrowed sword, because ice was lost, and because a king who passed a sentence should swing the blade. Ned had taught his sons that, and Robb had not forgotten it even now, even in the depth of everything. It was done cleanly. Bolton did not flinch from it. Whatever else the man had been, he met his end with the same cold composure he had carried through his treachery, and Jon found, watching, that he could not even hate him properly, because there was nothing in Roose Bolton to hate, no passion, no malice, just a cold ledger of advantage that had finally come up short. He was a thing that had calculated, and lost, and accepted the loss. The hating wanted a person, and there was no person there. The Dreadfort opened its gates the next day. Bolton's bastard son, a cruel thing, Jon was told, byblow of the dead lord, a boy named Ramsay with a reputation that made hard Northmen go quiet, had been holding the castle. And when the Dreadfort's own garrison learned that Lord Roose was dead, and the king in the north was at the gates with the whole weight of the north behind him and a charge of broken guest right, that damned the whole house. They did the arithmetic Roose Bolton had taught them to do, and they opened the gates and gave up the bastard rather than die for a dead traitor's name. What became of Ramsay Snow? Jon did not watch either. He had seen enough of what men did to other men. He let Robb's justice be Robb's justice, and he stood in the yard of the Dreadfort with ghosts beside him and felt the war turning. Felt the thing that had been bleeding the north to death for 2 years finally. Slowly, beginning to close. They had won. Catelyn was still dead. Both things were true, and the second one did not get smaller because of the first. The North. What the survival bought. The war did not end at the Twins, but it turned there. That was the thing that became clear in the months after. that the Red Wedding had been the Lannisters' masterstroke, the single blow meant to end the Northern cause in one night of blood, and that the blow had failed, and a masterstroke that fails leaves the man who threw it worse off than before he tried. Tywin Lannister had spent his credibility on the Freys and the Boltons, had broken the most sacred law in Westeros to win the North in a night, and he had not won the North. And now everyone knew what he had been willing to do. Houses that had stayed neutral looked at what the Lannisters had done at the twins and were afraid. A crown that would break guest right was a crown that would do anything, and lords who would not lift a sword for the Starks would still, very quietly, decline to help a regime that murdered its guests. The Lannister cause did not collapse. It was too strong for that. Tywin too able, but it stopped winning. And in a long war, the side that stops losing is the side that wins in the end. The North came home. Robb crossed the twins, the crossing he had needed all along, taken now for good. The bridge that had been a trap turned into the Stark cause's own road north, and he brought the army home to a north that had been occupied and broken in his absence, and he set about taking it back. The Ironborn were driven from the coasts. Winterfell's ashes were reclaimed. And word came in time that Bran and Rickon were not dead after all, that they had been hidden, had survived the fall of Winterfell, were alive beyond the wall and in the care of loyal men, and Robb wept again at that news. But they were the good tears this time, the kind that wash something instead of cutting it. The Stark cause survived. It survived because of one night and one warning, and a woman who had done the arithmetic of her own death and found it an easy sum. Robb became a different king after the twins. Jon watched it happen and grieved it even as he understood it. The boy who had ridden south to save his father, bold, warm, quick to laugh, quick to love. The Robb who followed his heart into a marriage that nearly killed them all. That boy was gone, burned out of him in the Hall of the Twins. What replaced him was harder and colder and more careful. A king who read the board the way Jon had begged him to, who trusted no man's welcome until he had tested it, who kept his own counsel and moved his pieces with the patience of a man who had learned what came of warmth. He was a better king for it. He was a lesser man for it. Both were true, and Jon could not decide in the years after whether the trade had been worth it, and suspected Robb could not either. They did not speak of Catelyn often. When they did, it was carefully, around the edges, the way you handle a wound that has closed but not healed. Robb carried it the way a man carries the knowledge that his own life was purchased with his mother's. Not guilt, exactly, because there had been no choice in it, but a debt that could never be paid, because the creditor was dead. He ruled well in part to be worth it. That was the only payment available, and he made it every day. And it was never enough. And he knew it was never enough. And he made it anyway. That was the cost of the survival. Not just Catelyn's death, Robb's transformation, the warmth traded for the wisdom, the boy traded for the king. The Red Wedding had been meant to kill Robb Stark, and in a sense it had. It had killed the Robb who walked into the hall. The one who walked out wore his face and his name and ruled in his place. And he was formidable, and he was not the same. The brothers. What could not be mended? They tried, in the months after, to be what they had been. It was Jon who tried hardest, because Jon was the one who could see it slipping and could not bear to watch it go. He sought Robb out the way he had as a boy, in the yard, at the practice, late by the fire, and he tried to find the old ease between them, the thing that had been theirs before crowns and wars and weddings. And it was there, sometimes in flashes. They would fall into the old way of talking, the half-sentences and the shared jokes and the comfortable silences of two boys raised in the same hall. And for a moment it would be Winterfell again, before any of it. And then one of them would remember. It did not take much. A word that brushed too close to the twins. a turn of phrase that had been Catelyn's, the sight of grey wind and ghost lying together, 2 of the 6 wolves, and the thought of how the litter had scattered. Any of it could do it, could bring the night back into the room, the hall and the fire and the woman in the castle yard. And the ease would drain out of the moment and leave the 2 of them sitting with the thing between them that neither could name and neither could move. Because Robb knew. That was what Jon could not get past in the end. Robb knew that Jon had been right about everything, the whole way, the Freys and Bolton and the trap and the need to be careful, right when no one would believe him, right when his own brother smiled and looked away. And Robb knew that the price of not believing the deserter had been his mother's life. He never said it. He was too good a man and loved Jon too well to say it. But it lived behind his eyes, and Jon saw it there, every time. The flicker before the love covered it. You tried to tell me, and I didn't listen. And she died. It was not blame. Jon could have borne blame. It was worse than blame. It was the unbearable knowledge they shared and could not speak, that the warmth Robb had ridden south carrying, the openness, the readiness to trust a welcome and believe the best of men, had been a kind of innocence, and the innocence had cost his mother her life, and the man sitting across the fire from him was the one who had tried to warn him out of it and failed. You should hate me a little, Jon said to him once, late, when they had both had too much wine, and the truth was closer to the surface than it usually got to come. Robb looked at him. Why would I hate you? You saved my life. That's why. Because every day, I'm proof that you should have listened to me and didn't. Because I'm the one who was right. Men don't forgive the ones who were right, Robb. Not all the way. Not when being right costs them something they can't get back. There's a part of you that looks at me and sees the warning you ignored. I'd rather you hated me cleanly than carried that. I don't hate you. Robb's voice was rough. Jon, I can't. You're the last person alive who knew me before. Before the crown, before all of it. Mother's gone. Father's gone. The girls are gods know where. Bran and Rickon are. They're alive, but they're not mine anymore. They came back, changed. The little one half wild, and Bran, something I don't have a word for. You're the only one left who remembers when I was just Robb. How could I hate the only person who remembers that I was ever just Robb? And there it was. The thing that bound them, and the thing that could not be born. The same thing. Jon was the last of the old life, and the old life was the thing whose ending they were both grieving, and Jon was its keeper. And every time Robb looked at him, he saw both the brother he loved and the world he had lost. And a man cannot live forever looking at the proof of his own ruined innocence across the supper table. Jon understood that night that he was going to have to leave. Not because Robb wanted him gone. Robb would have kept him close forever, would have legitimized him and given him lands and made him the right hand of the throne. But because staying meant being, for the rest of both their lives, the daily reminder of the worst night either of them had lived. Robb could not heal with the warning sitting across from him, and Jon could not heal anywhere within sight of the hall where he had kept a promise that left a woman to die. They were going to have to lose each other to survive what they had survived together. It was the cruelest arithmetic of all, and there was no Catelyn left to do it for them, so Jon did it himself, slowly, over the months, working up to the thing he already knew he had to say. Jon, the thing he could not outrun. And Jon could not go home. He understood it slowly, over the months, the way you understand a thing you have been refusing to look at. He had ridden south to save his brother, and he had saved his brother, and there was no road back from the saving. Not for Jon, not clean. He was an oath-breaker. That had not changed. Whatever he had done at the Twins, whatever lives he had saved, he had still deserted the Night's Watch, still ridden away from a vow sworn before the old gods in the snow, and the North that loved the Starks also held the old laws sacred. And the oldest law for a man who wore the black was that he wore it until he died. Jon had ridden away from forever. The North knew it. The men who had fought beside him at the Twins knew it. They were grateful to him. He had saved the king. Every man knew it. The story of the bastard who roared the warning that turned the Red Wedding was already passing into the kind of tale that men told by fires. But gratitude and honor were different things. And the same men who toasted Jon Snow's name would not have let their daughters marry an oathbreaker. And Jon felt the difference in every hall he entered. He had bought Robb's life with his own honor. That was the trade he had made. The night he rode out of Castle Black. Though he had not known the shape of it then. He had spent the one thing a bastard could own, his unbroken word, and he had bought his brother's survival with it. And the purchase was good, and the coin was gone, and there was no getting it back. And there was the other thing, the worst thing, the thing he carried that no one else fully knew. He had let Catelyn die. He had kept his promise. He had done exactly what she asked, what she made him swear by the fire. Robb first, always Robb. Whatever it cost. Whoever it cost. He had grabbed his brother's reins and hauled him through the postern, while Catelyn Stark threw herself on the Frey swords, and he had not turned back, because she had made him promise not to, because turning back would have killed Robb too, and made her death meaningless. He had done the right thing. He knew he had done the right thing. And he had still left a woman to die in a castle yard. The woman who had never loved him. The woman who had, 2 nights before her death, finally looked at him and admitted she had been wrong about him his whole life, and had asked him, in the same breath, to be the instrument of her sacrifice. There was a cruelty in that arithmetic that Jon could not stop turning over. Catelyn Stark had spent 17 years being cold to him, had finally warmed to him only at the very end, and had used that final warmth to bind him to the act of leaving her to die. She had made the boy she never loved into the last hand that failed to save her. And she had done it on purpose, because she trusted him to keep the promise where Robb would have broken it, because she knew that Jon Snow's broken but not dead honor would hold him to a vow that love would have shattered. She had used his honor to die. The honor he thought he'd thrown away. It turned out he had just enough of it left for her to spend. Jon could not make peace with it. He tried. He told himself the truths. That he had saved Robb. That Catelyn had chosen it. That he had kept a promise made to a dying woman's certainty. That without him, the whole wedding party died and the North fell, and Catelyn's death brought nothing instead of everything. All true. None of it reached the place where the thing actually lived, which was lower and older than reason, in the part of him that had spent his whole life wanting Catelyn Stark to look at him with something other than cold, and had finally gotten it, for one night, by a fire, as the price of agreeing to leave her to the swords. He could not go home to Winterfell. Winterfell was where Catelyn should have been in the years to come, old and grey and surrounded by grandchildren, and she was not going to be there. Because of a night Jon had walked her into and out of without her. He could not sit at the table where she had sat. He could not look at Robb across that table, and both of them know what they both knew. He could not be the family's saving and the family's wound at once, in the same hall, every day, forever. So he did not stay. The parting, what the brothers said. He told Robb in the Godswood at Winterfell, when the war had turned far enough that the telling could happen. The castle was being rebuilt around them, Winterfell rising from its ashes, scaffolding on the broken towers, the sounds of masons and carpenters where Theon's fire had been, The Godswood had survived. The Godswood always survived. It was older than the castle, older than the Starks, and the heart tree had watched the burning the way it watched everything, without judgment and without comfort. "I'm leaving," Jon said. Robb did not look surprised. He had become a man who was rarely surprised after the twins. He stood by the heart tree with the new hardness in his face and the old love underneath it, and he looked at his brother. "Where?" Robb said. "I don't know yet. East. Maybe. Essos. Somewhere the name Snow means nothing and the name Stark means nothing, and nobody knows what I did or didn't do." Jon looked at the heart tree. "Somewhere I can just be a man with a sword and a wolf." "You saved my life," Robb said. "You saved the North. You're a hero, Jon. The whole North knows it. I could make you. I'll legitimize you." "Jon Stark, I should have done it already. I should have done it the day we took the twins. Father always wanted. I can give you the name. I can give you a keep, lands, a place. You'd be my brother-in-law as well as blood. No one would ever call you Snow again." It was everything Jon had wanted. Once. The name. The legitimacy. To be a Stark in truth, and not just in shadow. Robb was offering him the thing he had ached for his entire childhood. The thing he had once thought he would give anything for. "No," Jon said. "Jon, I'm an oathbreaker, Robb. You can put the name Stark on me, but you can't take the black off me. Not really. Not where it counts. I swore a vow to the Watch before the old gods, right here, in a Godswood like this one. And I broke it. Legitimizing me doesn't unbreak it. It just means an oathbreaker carries the name Stark, and I won't do that to Father's name. He kept his vows. He died keeping them. I'm not going to put his name on the man who didn't." Jon held his brother's gaze. "And I can't stay here. You know I can't. Every day I'm here is a day we both look at each other and think about that hall, and about her, and about what it cost to get you out. You can't heal with the wound sitting across the table from you. I'm the wound, Robb. I'm the saving and the wound both. You need me gone so you can be the king without me reminding you every day what the crown cost." Robb's jaw worked. "That's not. You're not a wound. I let your mother die," Jon said, quiet. Final, the thing neither of them had said out loud in all the months. "I kept the promise she made me swear, and I let her die. And every time you look at me, you know it, even when you don't want to know it. I see it, Robb, just for a flicker, before the love covers it. You look at me, and for half a breath you see the man who could have turned the horse around." He held his brother's gaze. "I would have died for her. If she'd let me choose, I'd have stayed in that yard and died covering her, and sent you out with someone else's hand on the reins. She didn't let me choose. She chose. And she chose me to be the one who lived with it, because she knew I'd keep the promise. That was her last gift to you, and her last cruelty to me, and they were the same act. And I can't sit at her table for the next 40 years pretending they weren't." The Godswood was quiet. Robb crossed the space between them, the way he had at the firelight outside Riverrun a lifetime ago, and he embraced his brother. And this time, it was the king in the north, holding on to the only person left alive who had known him before the crown. "You're the best man I know," Robb said into his shoulder. "Whatever you think you are. Oathbreaker, deserter, bastard, I don't care what the words say. You rode 800 miles and threw away your honor and your life and your home because I was alone in the south and you couldn't bear it. And you were right about all of it, the whole way, and no one listened, and you saved us anyway. That's not a man without honor, Jon. That's the only kind of honor that ever mattered. The kind that does the right hard thing when it costs you everything and no one believes you and no one thanks you for it." He pulled back and held Jon by the shoulders. "Mother saw it. At the end. She told me, the night before the twins. She said you had Father's honor. More than I did. She was right." "She told me that too," Jon said. "By the fire. The night she made me promise." "Then believe it," Robb said. "Wherever you go. Believe the last true thing my mother ever said about a man She spent your whole life being wrong about you, and she figured it out at the end, and she told us both. Don't make her wrong again by deciding you're the thing she finally stopped believing you were. Jon could not answer that. There was no answer to it. There's one more thing, Robb said, before you go. I need you to hear it from me, because no one else will say it, and you need to carry it east. He swallowed. She didn't choose you to die because you mattered least, Jon. I know that's the thing you're telling yourself, that she sent you out with me and stayed behind herself because the bastard and the king were worth saving and she wasn't. That's not what happened. She chose to die because she was the mother and I was the son, and that's the order of it, the way it's always been, the way it'll always be. And she chose you to carry me out because she trusted you more than she trusted anyone left alive. Do you understand what that means? At the end, the very end, when it was all stripped down to the one thing that mattered, Catelyn Stark put her son's life in the hands of the boy she'd been cold to for 17 years. Because when it was real, when it was everything, you were the one she trusted. Not her brother, not the lords. You. Jon stood in the Godswood and could not speak. She was wrong about you your whole life, Robb said, and right about you at the end. And the end is the part that counts. That's the thing I need you to carry. Not that she used you, that she chose you. There's a difference, and you're going to spend years telling yourself there isn't, and I need you to know, wherever you are, that there is. I don't know if I can believe that, Jon said. Then don't believe it yet, Robb said. Just carry it. Believe it later, when you're ready. Mother would have, his voice caught. Mother would have wanted you to have it. The thing she couldn't give you while she was alive. She gave it to you at the end, in the only way she knew how, by trusting you with the thing she loved most in the world. That was her saying it, Jon. That was as close as she could come to saying it. Take it. Jon held his brother's gaze in the green light of the Godswood, and something in him that had been clenched since the night by the fire, since the promise, since the yard, since the swords, loosened. Just slightly. Not all the way, but enough. All right, Jon said. I'll carry it. Good, Robb said. He held his brother one more time, in the Godswood, under the heart tree. And then he let go. The road away, the last image. Jon Snow left Winterfell the way he had left the wall, at first light, quietly, with the white wolf beside him, and a stolen feeling weight in his chest, though this time nothing was stolen, and the leaving was clean, or as clean as anything was for him anymore. Robb did not come to the gate. They had said their farewell in the Godswood, and there was nothing to add to it, and a king had a castle to rebuild and a north to hold, and could not be seen weeping at a gate over a brother who was, in the eyes of the law, an oathbreaker leaving in disgrace. They both understood it. The understanding was its own last gift between them. But Bran came. Bran had returned to Winterfell by then, from beyond the wall, changed in ways that Jon did not fully understand, quieter, older than his years, with a way of looking at a man that suggested he saw more than a boy should. He could not walk. The fall that Jon had heard about, the fall from the tower that had started so much, had taken his legs. He was carried to the gate in a basket on a strong man's back, and he watched Jon prepare to ride out with the strange, still gaze that was new in him. You're going east, Bran said. It was not a question. Bran said few things as questions anymore. I am. You'll come back, Bran said. Not soon. But you'll come back. When the dead come, you'll come back. The north will need its wolves then. All of them. Jon looked at his little brother, at the boy who had fallen and lived, who had gone beyond the wall and come back something other than a boy, who spoke of the dead the way other men spoke of the weather. "The dead," Jon said.
"You'll understand," Bran said. "Later, the war you're leaving isn't the real one. The real one is still coming, and it comes from the north, behind the wall you broke your vow to guard." Something that was almost a smile, and was sadder than weeping, crossed the boy's still face. "You'll guard it again, in the end. The vow you broke. You'll keep it after all, when it matters. That's how it works, I think. The things we break, we get to mend, if we live long enough." Jon did not know what to say to that. He never quite knew what to say to Bran anymore. "Look after Robb," Jon said instead. "I will," Bran said. "Look after yourself. And Ghost." The strange gaze settled on the wolf. "He'll be needed too. Keep him close. There's a part of you that lives in him, and you'll want it before the end." Jon swung up onto his horse. He looked back at Winterfell one last time, the broken towers rising again, the grey walls, the home he was leaving for the second time and could not stay in, the place where his father had raised him and his father's wife had died for his brother, and where the boy in the basket spoke of a war that hadn't come yet. He looked at it, and he felt all of it, the love and the grief and the shame and the strange cold promise in Bran's words, and he turned the horse east toward a country where no one knew his name. Ghost ran beside him. The white wolf made no sound. He never did. He ran through the morning with the silence that had named him, and his red eyes caught the rising sun, and he did not question where they were going, because there was Jon, and there was everything that was not Jon, and the wolf knew the difference and followed. Jon Snow rode away from his home for the second time. He had saved his brother. He had turned the Red Wedding into the grave of the men who made it. He had done a thing that the songs would sing about when the singers learned the shape of it. The bastard who broke his oath and rode south on a feeling and saved the king in the north when no one would believe him. And he could not go home, because the saving had cost a mother her life and a brother his warmth and Jon the last of the honor he had ridden out to spend. And some things, once spent, do not come back, no matter how good the thing you bought with them. He had won. He rode east alone, an oathbreaker with a wolf, into the grey morning, carrying it all. He had won, and it had cost him everything, and that, Bran might have told him, if Jon had asked, is the only kind of victory the gods of the north have ever offered anyone. The wall waited in the north for the vow he would, one day, come back to keep. But that is another story. This one ends on a road going east, with a man and a white wolf, and a home behind them that they saved and cannot enter, growing smaller in the morning light until the hills take it, and it is gone.